Headphones.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We've got a few new folks here. I just remind everybody to please mute your phones, and if you would like to address the commission, make sure you fill out a blue sheet, and we'll make sure you're recognized. With that, we will move to agenda item 9. Alan Osterland.
President Culver, Commission, Secretary Talbot. As you all know, we're responsible for managing all the species in Wyoming. The large species as well as the small species. We've got quite a few species that are species of greater conservation need. Some of these have very limited populations within the state, limited distributions. We've got the large iconic species that you hear a lot about, grizzly bears and wolves and black-footed ferrets that we do a lot of research on, and we collect a lot of information. Some of the things in the aquatic realm that you don't hear about are some of these native species of fish that we have in the state of Wyoming. A lot of these are small, very limited distributions. So what we wanted to do today is present some information that concerning one of these species, the horny head chub. And it is a species of greatest conservation need, and all the information that we can get on this species perhaps one day will keep it from being petitioned. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brian Hickerson. Brian is a graduate student with the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Wyoming. His master's research, which he expects to complete this spring, focuses on the conservation and recovery of the horny head chub in Wyoming. Brian has a bachelor's degree in fisheries conservation and management from the University of Arizona. And Brian previously worked in native fish research and management with the Arizona Game and Fish Department and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian, and I want to tell him thank you for taking the time to come and present today.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of my research today, especially on the conservation and recovery of horny head chub. Not happy today, huh? There we go. All right, so get us started. Horny head chub is a species of minnow native to the state of Wyoming, and it's a pretty unique little fish. It gets its name from these very pronounced spawning tubercles. If you can see that on the top of its head, and that's why it has its name. They get these during the spawning season, and male horny head chub will use these to defend breeding territories against other males, much in the same way deer or elk would use their antlers.
Really?
They also use these bumps on their head to move around rocks, and they'll actually pick some up in their mouth to make these elaborate spawning nests you can see in the bottom right here. And it's pretty impressive because these fish can make these nests that are up to 3 feet wide and composed of hundreds of rocks, and it's a pretty big effort for a fish that only reaches a maximum size of about 7 inches. It is a species of greatest conservation need in Wyoming, with the NSS 1AA status, meaning that it's imperiled with extreme limiting factors that continue to increase in severity. Now, some of the other threats to horny head chub are negative hydrological effects of dams and diversions, like the Wheatland Tunnel diversion pictured here, which is currently the upstream barrier to chub distribution in the Laramie River. They currently cannot pass it. These structures can also build up silt, which when periodically released can cover up the rocks horny head chubs need to build their nests, and silt in nests, which negatively affects their spawning success. Also, poor land use practices like excessive streamside grazing, again, can introduce silt to the stream and have those same negative impacts on nests. Most importantly, catastrophic events like the Raffo Fire of 2012 led to the extirpation of the North Laramie River population following a flood, which killed that entire population. Also, horny head chub are not adapted to the presence of large-bodied native predators. So the presence of non-native predators could negatively impact chub populations. And chub might be particularly sensitive to these non-native predators compared to other native species because, again, they build these nests that they like to defend, so they're potentially at an increased susceptibility at this time. Another unique thing about horny-head chub is that they're what is known as a glacial relic species. We can see this yellow shaded area is their distribution across the United States. And in Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas, they're isolated by hundreds of miles from their nearest neighboring populations. And that's the result of being isolated to little patches of suitable habitat after glaciers retreated after the last ice age. So it's pretty cool that they've hung on in Wyoming for so long in these little isolated areas. Historically, horny-head chub occupied streams along the Front Range of Wyoming and Colorado, from Box Creek in the Cheyenne River drainage to the Sweetwater River, North Laramie River, Rawhide Creek in the North Platte River drainage, and St. Vrain Creek and Boulder Creek in the South Platte River drainage. But by 2013, horny-head chub were restricted to just 42 kilometers to the Laramie River. Now, the Cheyenne and Box Creek populations were probably extirpated by drought effects and lack of water sometime after the 1950s. The St. Vrain and Boulder Creek populations in Colorado were killed by mine waste spills, and in the North Laramie River population again was extirpated after the Arapahoe fire. But we still don't know what happened to the Sweetwater River population. Now, things have improved somewhat recently. The Laramie Region Fish Management Crew has reintroduced horny-head chub to the North Laramie River in the last couple of years. But this sudden disappearance of chub populations in the landscape highlights the need to have multiple populations out there if we want to have horny-head chub in the future. So some of the concerns for horny-head chub listed in the State Wildlife Action Plan are that they have a restricted population size, which makes them susceptible to extirpation from disease or habitat alteration. Also, we often find horny-head chub in association with some non-native piscivores, which could potentially reduce chub populations through predation or competition. So Wyoming Game and Fish came to us in 2015, and they asked us to develop a project addressing these concerns. So our first study objective was to evaluate potential translocation sites for horny-head chub within the plausible historic range. And the second objective is to evaluate the effect of non-native predators on the abundance and distribution of horny-head chub in the Laramie River. So I'm mostly going to focus on this first objective today. Now, typically when we carry out translocations, we have hatchery stocks of fish that we can use. So if you go out and stock a stream and it doesn't take, it's not really that big of a problem because you can go back to the hatchery and try again. But in the case of horny-head chub, we don't have a hatchery population, so all fish used in any translocations have to come from the wild. In that case, we do have a really limited resource, and there is a large cost to not having successful translocation. Often when people think about translocations, they rely on expert opinion to select sites. But in our case, since we're dealing with such a limited source population, we want to take an analytical and rigorous approach to make sure we maximize our potential translocation success and better conserve this really constricted resource. An important point is that the Laramie River, where horny-head chub persist, seem to have some important characteristics. Namely, that it has suitable habitat with a relatively intact and diverse native fish community, and relatively few non-native predators when compared to other streams in the North Platte. Also, this area seems to have limited historical widespread disturbance when compared to some other areas. So we want to find translocation sites that look most similar to this in terms of fish community and habitat, and in that way we might find our best possible translocation sites. So we decided to look for translocation sites on 12 streams in the North Platte River Basin. The Sweetwater River, Deer, Box Elder, Laprelle, Wagon Hound, Labont, Horseshoe, and Cottonwood, and Duck Creeks. The Upper Laramie River, which is the Laramie River between Wheatland Reservoir No. 2 and the Wheatland Tunnel Diversion, and Rawhide and Horse Creeks. At each of these sampling sites, we collected a number of habitat measurements, including water depth, water velocity, substrate, cover type, and bank stability, among many other things. We collected fish using backpack electrofishing, and we counted and identified all fish that we captured. So in 2016, shown here in orange, we sampled 24 sites, 2 on each of the 12 translocation streams. But last winter, we did some preliminary analysis, and 7 of these streams seem to have low potential to support a translocated population. So this past summer in 2017, we sampled 6 sites on our 5 most promising streams, shown here in green, for a total of 30 sites. Because we think habitat and fish community are important, we wanted to use a number of analysis types to get the best well-rounded picture of what's important for chub. We used habitat similarity and fish community similarity using a method called, it's a mouthful, but it's called non-metric multidimensional scaling. I'm not going to talk about it anymore today because it's kind of complicated. We also did a hornyhead chub abundance model using a hurdle model. And because we use these three techniques, they each key in on different things that might be important for chub, but none of these techniques tells us the whole picture. So we used a weighting system to weight the outcome of these points, with most similar sites receiving a score of 1 and least similar sites receiving a score of 0.25 for these analyses. And that way, at the end, we can look across analysis types which sites on average had the highest similarity. So this is what our habitat similarity analysis looked like on the ground. Basically, what we have here is that sites in green received a score of 1. They're the most similar sites. And sites in red received a score of 0.25. They're the least similar sites, with the colors in between being sites of moderate similarity. To give you an idea what a high similarity site looks like, this is the Sweetwater River at Devil's Gate. It received the highest score of 1. And this is a Lower Rawhide Creek site that received the lowest score of 0.25. When we compare this to sites on the Laramie River that are occupied by chub, we can visually see that the Sweetwater River is more similar than the Rawhide Creek. And in particular, it has a variety of rock sizes for chub to build nests. It has sufficient water volume and velocity, and a variety of habitat types. Rawhide Creek, on the other hand, had no rocks that we could find at that site, very limited water flow, and a very simple channel. So we're pretty confident that these analyses are doing a good job keying in on important features. We also did the similarity analysis for our fish community. Again, low scoring sites got a score of 0.25, and the high similarity sites got a score of 1. To give you an example of what a site scoring 1 looks like, at Horse Creek we collected stonecat, creek chub, white sucker, long-nosed dace, and just a few brown trout. Stonecat are important because they're rare throughout most of the North Platte drainage, but often found with hornyhead chub in the Laramie River. So this is a pretty similar fish community to where we might expect chub. But if we take a site that received a low score, say Upper Wagonhound Creek, it only had brook trout, no native fish, and a lot of them, so it received a low score. So we also think our fish community similarity analysis is doing a pretty good job. Our third analysis type was this predictive hornyhead chub abundance model. It's a little bit more complicated to explain, but basically it told us the number of chub you find at a site is a function of the number of non-native predators, the water velocity at that site, the width to depth ratio, the amount of cascade habitat, and the temperature of the water at that site. And this makes a lot of sense because this is a place where we found one of our highest abundance of chubs. It's pretty wide for its depth. It had few to no non-native predators. It has some nice backwater areas of minimum velocity for chub to use. And it was fairly cool compared to some other sites. So we took all those analyses and we added their scores together for every site. None of our sites received a perfect score of 3, but we did have 2 sites get a score of 2.75, one being the Sweetwater River at Devil's Gate and one in Horseshoe Creek. So that suggests these are our 2 most optimal translocation sites. And when we look at them and compare them to the Laramie River, where chub are found, we can see it's got a lot of important features. They all have a variety of rock types that are important for chub to build their nests. They have a variety of habitats that are important for chub. And they have sufficient water quantity and velocity. Of the 4 sites that received a score, or excuse me, of the 7 sites that received a score of 2.5 or better, 4 of them fell on the Sweetwater River. Now, coupled with the fact that we have historical records for hornyhead chub in the Sweetwater River, this suggests that the Sweetwater River is potentially the best place to look to establish a new population of chub. I should mention that we're still evaluating our models and analyses, so it's somewhat preliminary at this point, and potentially subject to change. We also need to look into the feasibility of conducting these translocations, things like land ownership and if there's conflicts with other existing fisheries or native species. So I want to move now quickly to our second objective, which is to evaluate the effect of non-native predators on chub in the Laramie River. These are the same Laramie River sites that we used for the first objective, but just to give you some reference, the study area was above the town of Wheatland and Gray Ox Reservoir in the Laramie River. Between 2016 and 17, we sampled 42 total sites on the Laramie River. And at each of these sites, we collected fish using backpack electrofishing. We weighed and measured all horny-head chub and non-native predators. And to figure out what these non-native fish were eating, for all fish over 7 inches, we collected diet samples using a stomach pump. It's a technique called gastric lavage, and that basically allows us to see what's in the fish stomach, and then we can release it alive. So when we started this research, we knew that rainbow, brook, and brown trout occupied the Laramie River with horny-head chub. We were most concerned about brown trout because they were the most abundant fish. But we quickly were surprised to find smallmouth bass in the Laramie River, and that's not something we planned for. And it turned out to have some major impacts, as we found. When we looked at number of horny-headed chub at a site, we found there was a strong and negative relationship with number of non-native predators. Importantly, at high numbers of non-native predators, you really can't have a lot of chub, in that at low to no non-native predators, you get your highest numbers of chub. I think you'll notice that there is some variability at low numbers of non-native predators, and that confirms our idea that habitat is also important and probably plays a role in some of that variability. When we looked at what predators were eating using this measure called index of relative importance, which basically just tells us how heavily each of these species are relying on different prey items, we see that brook trout in blue, brown trout in yellow, and rainbow trout in pink all relied heavily on aquatic invertebrates. And this group included things like mayflies, caddisflies, blackflies, typically things you'd fly fish with. But smallmouth bass, shown in green here, were much more piscivorous. They relied on fish as part of their diet more heavily than the other 3 species. When we looked at how often these predatory species ate fish, we see that rainbow, brook, and brown trout were all consistently had low levels of piscivory. Between about 3 and 4% of individuals had fish in their stomachs. Smallmouth bass, on the other hand, over a quarter of all individuals had some sort of fish remains in their stomach. Now, this is probably a pretty conservative estimate of actual piscivory because diet samples quickly decay. So this probably only represents the previous maybe 12 to 24 hours of feeding. So actual piscivory might be quite a bit higher than this. We did find that rainbow and brook trout ate horny-head chub over the course of the study, so predation on horny-head chub is a plausible cause for that decline we saw in that first graph. So this is important because we found that non-native predators do have a negative effect on horny-head chub populations, mostly driven by smallmouth bass, which are more piscivorous, rely on fish as a diet item more often, and eat fish at a smaller size. Smallmouth bass appear to be the main downstream limiting factor of horny-head chub at this time in the Laramie River. So historically, horny-head chub occupied this entire reach of the Laramie River as late as potentially the 1970s, but gray ox reservoirs completed in 1981 and bass were stocked. They didn't seem to expand too rapidly. As of 2009, they were still downstream of I-25, but by 2015, we first found them in our study reach, and by 2017, we found them at a point where they were not documented in extensive sampling in 2008. So this represents a rapidly emerging threat to horny-head chub, as horny-head chub currently are restricted to just 18 kilometers of habitat without bass. So to wrap up, we know that non-native predators have a negative influence on horny-head chub populations, mostly driven by smallmouth bass, which are of concern because they're rapidly expanding in the system. We know that Laramie River and North Laramie River populations are still subject to these catastrophic events like wildfires, and that the best way to fix both these concerns is to get more populations out in the landscape. We've shown that a comprehensive translocation approach that uses data to find translocation sites can potentially help maximize success when we do relocate populations. And so hopefully, at the end of this research, we'll be able to give managers a set of tools that they can use to conserve and recover horny-head chub in Wyoming in the future so that we can have them around for future generations. And with that, I want to thank Wyoming Game and Fish for funding this project, but especially Steve Gale of the Laramie region, Paul Garrity and Landard, Jeff Glade and Gordon Edwards and Casper, and all the landowners that let me sample for this project. If you have questions you want to email me, you can find my contact information on the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit website, and I'm happy to take any questions today.
Thank you, Brian. I have a question for you. How long lived is this species?
No one's aged them in Wyoming, but in the Midwest, 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Is the Wyoming and Colorado specimens, are they considered the same species and subspecies as the Midwestern states, or
They
is it a?
are, but no one has looked at the genetics of them. So
Okay.
no one knows if they're potentially genetically different.
Has this population ever been petitioned for listing?
Not to my knowledge.
Good. Other questions for Brian?
All right, thank you.
What-
So what do you, the way it looks to me, so if you're ever gonna transplant me and put them in the Sweetwater River, is that what the bottom line of this is?
At this point, that's what the data is seeming to suggest.
But you'd have to do what he's saying, like, you either gotta catch them where they're at or go in the Midwest and get them and bring them back, is that what they're,
Yeah, you'd probably want to use the Laramie River population just because it's geographically closer, and because it's been isolated for so long, it might be better adapted to conditions in the West. But there's probably several thousand individuals to use, but that just highlights the reason to get it right the first time, because you can't keep pulling out of that population, because then you'll have a problem eventually.
Were you a little surprised by the fact that the rainbow trout and brook trout tended to eat more of these than the brown trout?
Not really. We only found 30 brown trout in the river in 2 years, so there's not a lot of them. So that's probably why they don't have much of impact. And rainbow trout we've found almost 200, so they're probably having more impact just out of sheer numbers. But all 4 of those species are able to reproduce. We found juveniles of all 4 in the river.
Interesting. How many chub species do we have?
There's hornyhead chub and creek chub. Those are the only 2. Well, I guess there's flathead chub as well.
Do they coexist?
Hornyhead chub and creek chub do. Creek chub will actually share the nest sometimes, and so will common shiner.
I know as a kid I remember fishing Rawhide Creek catching chubs. I was
Yep.
just curious what chub that might have been at.
Depends on what year you were a kid. The hornyhead chub did used to exist in Rawhide Creek.
So
Creek chub still
I
exists
might be
there.
part of the problem. Thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions? Thank you for your presentation. Okay, with that, we will move to Dr. Mary Wood. Hank Edwards. On a chronic wasting disease update. All good news, right? It's cured.
I don't know if I'll have that much good news for you, but Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot, thank you for the opportunity to my presentation. If you would, Reverend. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to come and give you an update on our 2017 CWD surveillance for the state of Wyoming. I put this presentation together in the middle of December, so the presentation that hopefully will show up here soon is been updated since then. I went back and updated the statistics yesterday. So many of the things that were the graphs and numbers in your packet are probably out of date. This one will be more up to date. That said, we're still working on preliminary data. It'll take us a couple more weeks to get through all of our CWD surveillance data. But this is almost the last word, not quite. Very good. So, like I said, I put this presentation together in December. It's organized around, I'll talk a little bit about our surveillance program, how we design it, how we accomplish it, the different levels of surveillance. I'll talk a little bit about testing, and then what we're finding this year, especially in some of the trends in some of our herds that have been exposed to chronic wasting disease for a long time. I'll wrap up with some of the areas we're seeing CWD prevalence increase, as well as some of the changes in the hunter attitudes as they're hunting in these areas where CWD is present. So first of all, to start off, our CWD surveillance for 2017 is very similar to previous surveillance efforts, where we focus on that western leading edge. And the endemic area is shown here in red. So we're really concentrating our efforts in the Jackson region, Pinedale, as well as the Green River region. In addition, we also put a lot of focus, at least in 2017, on our historic endemic area. So that area where we have seen CWD for a very long time, we continue to monitor those herds to figure out what the prevalence of CWD is doing. So that included the Goshen Rim area, or Hunt Area 15, Laramie Mountains, Hunt Area 59, 60, and 64, South Converse herd, just south of Glen Rock, as well as the Bates Hole and Hat 6 herd in 66 and 67. We also looked at those elk herds that overlap those areas, and that included the Laramie Peak, Muddy Mountain herd, as well as the Iron Mountain herd, Hunt Area 6. We collected our samples by the usual ways. The vast majority of our samples come through check stations, but we also utilize meat processors, taxidermists, field checks, regional office, head drops. Head drops are very popular up in the Grand Teton National Park and around the National Elk Refuge. But this is a very large departmental effort. It involves lots of field personnel, as well as hiring 5 temporary field technicians to chase down samples, as well as 2 CWD feed ground technicians, which just monitor those populations around the feed ground. Our CWD samples fall into 3 categories, if you will. The first of all is hunter killed, and that just as it sounds, it's a random sampling of harvested animals. This is really good for determining prevalence within a given population or area. And this makes up the vast majority of our surveillance effort. About 83% of our samples come from hunter killed. Then we use roadkill. We know that CWD positive animals are more likely to get hit by a car. So this is a very good cost-effective surveillance tool to use in new areas, and it makes up about 10% of our surveillance effort. And then finally, targeted animals. Targeted surveillance means we're targeting those animals that are showing signs of chronic wasting disease. This is the very best detection to use in new areas because it's very biased towards CWD positive animals, and it makes up about 7% of our surveillance effort. Once those samples are collected, they end up in our laboratory, of course, where we use an ELISA test. ELISA test is very rapid, takes about 6 hours from the time we receive the sample, process it, until the results are kicked out the door. It costs us about $16 a sample. That's based on laboratory costs. That does not include personnel costs or costs that were incurred in the field. All samples are tested 3 times before they're reported back to all positives are confirmed 3 times before they're reported back to the sportsman. And we do that not only to make sure that that sample is truly positive and the test is working correctly, but it's a double check on our system to make sure samples didn't get mixed up. Immunohistochemistry is also used, or IHC. This is the gold standard. It's the test that's been around the longest. It takes about 2 weeks to get done, about twice the price at $30 a sample. And we utilize IHC whenever we get a positive outside of our known endemic area. So we'll use the ELISA to confirm it, and then we'll double confirm it, if you will, using the immunohistochemistry test.
Hank, we have the capability of performing both of these tests in-house?
That's a good question. We do not. We only have the ELISA that's done in our laboratory. The immunohistochemistry is done by the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory. Once the testing is done, we are able to turn around all of our results back to the submitter, usually within 3 weeks. All those hunters who are unfortunate enough to harvest a CWD positive animal, they're notified by letter, and all results, both positive and negative, are available on our website. So moving on to results, this year we tested 3,878 samples as of the end of the year. We identified 4 new deer hunt areas, Hunt Area 19, 52, 118, and 139, as well as 1 elk and hunt area 48 in the southern Bighorns. So as you can see, the graph at the bottom, we're slowly increasing our surveillance effort. You can see quite an increase over the last 3-4 years. And we expect this to continue as we do more surveillance for this disease across the state. Here's a map of the new positive deer areas. Those hashed areas is the 2016 CWD endemic area. So the first area, Hunt Area 19 up by Gillette, that was a targeted doe that was submitted in September. Hunt Area 52 and the Western Bighorns and Hunt Area 118 were both positives that were discovered during the hunting season. So that was October and November. And then finally, Hunt Area 139 was the positive doe that was collected at the Pinedale Airport in February. So you can see we're using both surveillance methods here, both targeted and hunter-killed areas and hunter-killed samples to identify these new areas. And the same is true with the one elk area, Hunt Area 48. That was a targeted elk that was collected in July. Finally, this is a map that shows all the positive, CWD positive locations across the state. And I think if you were to look at this map and compare it to previous maps, you'd find some similarities in that most of our positives occur in the southeastern corner, right? And that's true in this map as well. But we're also seeing a lot more positives up in the Bighorn Basin, as well as the eastern slope of the Bighorn Mountains. So a lot of that is probably reflective of our sampling effort, but we're getting quite a distribution of CWD, particularly up in that northern portion. Again, this map shows the 2016 endemic area and the slashed areas, and then you can see those new positives that are outside that area. So that gives you an idea of just how far some of those positives occur. The one in Pinedale was quite a ways away, whereas the one up in near Gillette was just on the border. As far as numbers so far, and I won't go through this in big detail, but you can see for all of our surveillance, mule deer make up the vast majority of it. So for hunter-killed mule deer, we looked at 1,700 deer. 205 of those were positive. 347 white-tailed deer with 39 positives. Just over 1,000 elk with 24 positives, and 23 moose with no positives, giving us a total of 3,118 hunter-killed animals with 268 positives. We looked at 431 targeted animals, 62 positives, 329 road-killed animals with 13 positives, for a total of 3,878 with 343 positives. Moving on to trends and kind of what we're seeing, this is the South Converse mule deer herd, Hunt Area 65. You can see this is a long-term data set. We were able to collect 52 samples for this hunt area, and we ended up with a prevalence of 35%. That trend line is based on a 3-year average, and you can see that it is starting to drop, or at least starting to level off. We have no idea if this trend is going to continue, but based on what we're seeing so far, the prevalence is starting to decrease, at least in this herd unit. The same is true for the Laramie Mountains mule deer herd unit. We were able to collect 194 samples from these 3 hunt areas, which is 59, 60, and 64. And we ended up with an N prevalence of just less than 20%. Again, a similar trend, we're seeing a decrease in CWD prevalence. We're not sure why that is. We're not sure what's driving this. Is this related to the age structure of the population itself in terms of numbers, or many other factors that quite honestly we just don't have a good grasp on that may change CWD prevalence over time. A little different situation with elk. As you can see, our CWD prevalence in elk bounces around a lot. We collected a lot of samples in Hunt Area 7 this year, 179 in total. Whoops, wrong way forward in. There we go. We collected 179 samples for these 2 hunt areas, which is Hunt Area 7 and Hunt Area 19, and we ended up with a prevalence of 8.9%. That is just higher than what we've seen in the past, but for the most part, this population, or the CWD prevalence in this population, bounces around like I mentioned, but for the most part, it stays right between 7 and 9%. A little different for Iron Mountain elk herd. This is hunt area 6. Much higher prevalence this year. We're at 12.7%. We collected 63 samples from this area. As you can see, it's similar to hunt area 7 in that prevalence bounces around quite a bit, but the prevalence is still higher than hunt area 7. Mule deer areas of concern. So unlike some of our historic endemic area, we're seeing CWD prevalence increase in some of our other areas. Hunt area 15, we're able to get quite a few samples this year, 81 samples in total, and we ended up with an prevalence of 35%. This is quite a bit higher than what we've seen in the past. Hunt area 66, similar situation. They collected a tremendous number of samples, 114, and ended up with a prevalence of 27%. Again, this is higher than what we've seen in the past. Hunt area 30 in the bighorns, unfortunately a small sample size of only about 15 animals, but still a pretty alarming prevalence of 40%. And we're seeing that with all those hunt areas, so 23, 24, 27, and 33, where we don't have a great sample size, but based on the sample sizes we are able to get, we're starting to see CWD prevalence increase in some of those areas. So that certainly is an area where we want to target some of our future surveillance efforts. And finally, hunt area 41, sitting at 19%. Decent sample size, but that prevalence is almost double from what it was in 2016. So again, worthy of our getting in there and looking at many more animals in the 2018 surveillance. And the same is true for hunt area 119. Small sample size, unfortunately, of only 16, but a significant increase of what we've seen in previous years. Finally, this is my last slide, and realize that we spend a lot of time talking to hunters. Whether that hunter called because he got a positive CWD test result and he wants more information, whether somebody's calling us to figure out how they can get their animal tested, or somebody just wants to know more about CWD. So we talk to a lot of people through the years, or through the hunting season. And some of our observations is I think hunters are becoming much more aware, one, of the human health concerns of CWD, two, the potential impacts that this disease could have on our herds. And in addition, people are taking more of an effort to know about CWD and where they can get their animal tested long before they've ever left the house. So this is now part of the planning process as people are working out their elk and deer hunts. And also people are all taking steps to learn to live with the disease while continuing to hunt. And whether that means they simply freeze their quarters until they get their test results, or if they have some place to hang it. But for the most part, people are waiting to get their test results before they process that animal. All this is kind of leading to an increased demand for testing. I think the sample collection at regional offices was really popular. It gives hunters a place that they know they can take their animal during business hours and get their animal tested. Also, we are able to do a very rapid return of results. For the most part, we're able to return results within a week from the time they hit our laboratory, which means that for an average hunter, it's about a 2-week turnaround. Well, that's a pretty good rapid return of results for most people. And people, like I said, are wanting those results before they pay that processing fee or they cut it up themselves. So all that is really leading into what we think is going to be quite a demand, an increased demand for testing. As we go on, more and more people are becoming aware. We're making testing easy, and we can certainly see where testing is going to start to really take off. That has concerns for us, of course, because our laboratory is responsible for many things, not just chronic wasting disease. We also do a lot of other testing in that laboratory. So I think this is something we're going to have to pay very close attention to, make sure our laboratory is able to meet the demand as CWD testing increases. That's all I have. Any questions?
So do you have plans to meet this increased demand for testing in the future?
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot, We do have plans. We've looked into what it'll take for us to increase our capacity at least to 6,000 to 8,000 samples a year. So yes, we're looking at all the gamuts, not just at that level, but what it would take to even test 50,000 samples a year, which I'm not sure we'll be able to do. But yeah, we're looking at those possibilities.
Questions for Pat?
What does it take to increase our laboratory capacity? Are we talking about a building, personnel, more test kits?
It depends on what level you're speaking. So where we're currently at with our current capacity and current facilities, we could probably handle 8,000 samples.
And how many are you doing today,
We're
roughly?
about 4,000, just less than that.
Now, this is a different lab than what we just built in Laramie, correct?
That's correct. We're across the interstate. We're housed within the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory.
Okay.
Mike?
Yeah, I just had a question on, Hank, looking back at one of your graphs here, or one of your slides, looks like there's been a case reported around Du Bois area, one found there, and then that one in Pinedale from last year.
Are you at the map of the positive locations?
Yeah, right
That one?
there. Any idea how that stuff moves that kind of range? I mean, clear over the Wind Rivers like that? I mean, is it possibly scattered by scavengers or predators, or is it hunters maybe disposing of a carcass, they've killed in another area of the state over there? And
That's a very good question. I think most of the research has shown that scavengers will probably play a very low role in spreading CWD. As far as hunter goes, I think that's a possibility, but remote. That said, I think it's important to keep in mind that our surveillance is still pretty limited compared to the number of animals that are killed in the state and the number that we actually get our hands on to test. It's a pretty low number. So getting a good handle on exactly the distribution of CWD, I think is much harder than we let on. I think this gives you a good idea of where CWD occurs from our knowledge, but there's probably a lot more cases out there that at our level of surveillance we just can't detect.
right. Okay, thank you.
Mr. President?
Yes.
So here's a $1 million question. What are we doing proactively? We're doing increased surveillance, but I think the commission wanted to see some proactive kind of steps. So what are the plans there?
And I will let Dr. Mary Wood address that question. I think her presentation will cover some of those questions.
Do we have other questions for Hank? Yes.
Real quickly. Hank, the state lab's conducting the second test that you were talking about.
Yes, sir.
Now, is that mandatory, or is it, are we able to do that with the new facility that we will be taking?
They are the only ones in Wyoming that would do that test. You're talking about the immunohistochemistry or IHC?
Yeah.
Yes. They're the only ones that perform that test in the state.
Will we be able to in the future?
No, that takes a board-certified pathologist and some pretty expensive equipment to do that. So we're not set up, and we don't have the plans to do that. Not yet.
Yes.
Mr. President, I was looking at your slides on the South Converse mule deer and Laramie Mountains mule deer, and the prevalence is declining. Do you have a reason for that? I mean, that looks good, but is there something we don't know about that, or is it a potential where the chronic wasting get to an area where a natural immunity takes over and the prevalence will start declining, or is that wishful thinking?
The short answer to that is we just don't know. We just don't know the causes of those. There's many things that could be going on there. Could be the age of the herd. Maybe we're at a much younger age class. Population level, maybe it relates back to a die-off. We really don't know. And I think it's probably multifactorial, right? Where there's probably many factors that are interacting. And it'll take us a while to get our hands around that and really figure that out. What really drives prevalence? We're really looking at that.
One more, do we have any proximity to a field test, or is it just not possible?
We're not there yet. I think there are some companies that have tried to make a field test based on a blood test, but from my knowledge, that's not been accepted by the federal government by any means. So quite honestly, I think we're still a ways away from a field test. I don't see anything on the horizon.
One more question for Hank. Hank, how long, when one of our big game animals contracts CWD, how long can they survive with that?
Really depends on the genotype of the animal. So, like with elk, with a certain genotype, we know they can live 5, 7 years, maybe even longer than that. Deer, I don't know that it's been shown that they can last quite that long, but certainly genetics play a big role in how long an animal can survive in the face of CWD. We don't see any true resistance. In other words, there's no immunity or genetic resistance to ever getting the disease. It just seems like genetics play a role in how long the incubation period is.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hank. That's a very interesting presentation. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Dr. Wood. Welcome, Mary.
Good afternoon, President Culver, members of the Commission, Director Talbot. So Hank gave us the state of the state for CWD, and now I get the $1 billion question. And what are we going to do about CWD? Not sure how that works out. I'm pretty sure we should have convinced Hank to do this part, and I should have done the numbers.
He rapidly punted that to you, Mary.
I know. It was very quick, wasn't it? So as far as what are we actually going to do and where are we moving forward as far as actually trying to find something to do to manage this disease, and we are putting quite a lot of work into this, and we have made a lot of progress. I know I've mentioned this before. We began by actually putting together a CWD management team for our agency, and that team has sat down and we've done a literature review on chronic waste and disease literature. We've gone through and looked at our populations across the state to try and see what are we seeing with CWD in our populations. We've gone through and looked at management. We've looked at certainly all the literature related to management, but we've actually gone out and we've talked to those states, those agencies, those jurisdictions that have tried CWD management to try and actually learn from them. What did they do? How did it work? What did you learn from that? We did an internal agency survey actually to look at our own people to see what is our current knowledge base on chronic wasting disease in our agency, and what are our current internal attitudes towards CWD. And as we've gone through this process, we certainly had one key message come back to us, and that really was that communication is critical when you're looking at chronic wasting disease management. So the first thing that we really have started to look at within our CWD management team is developing a communications plan on how are we going to start and restart conversations about chronic wasting disease. Because the reality is any management that we're going to consider for CWD is going to be a long-term commitment. It's not going to be easy, and we're really going to be able to be more effective if we can communicate effectively with our communities, with our public, with our partner agencies, and that's really going to be our path to being successful in management. So our communications plan, I guess in the 10 million foot view is quite simple. You know, it's 3 main components. One is internal communications, and then we're looking at communications with some of our partners and our stakeholder groups, and then we're looking at a bigger, broader public communication. We started out with some of the internal agency communication. We spent a lot of time actually going around within our own agency talking about CWD, making sure our personnel are current and up to date on the latest research and information, what we do know about CWD. We've learned a lot about this disease in the last 30 years. And we spent a lot of time talking with folks in our different regions to sort of get some feedback. What are they seeing on the ground? What are they seeing in their region? Once we had a lot of those internal communications, we came back together as a group and we actually developed some agency communications and messaging around chronic wasting disease. And what is it that we want to convey about this disease? How is it that we want to talk about the disease and share this message? And so we put that together. We did do an internal webinar and we shared that again with all of our department people, because when it comes down to communications, our folks are out there on the ground every day talking to people, and we need to be sure that everybody in our agency is able to answer questions that they get when they're walking around in the field, and make sure that they actually understand what is our message, what is our concern, where are we moving forward as an agency with chronic waste and disease. So having our own agency personnel engaged and informed is definitely a critical first step if we're going to be effective. We have a department training coming up this spring, and we'll be doing a lot more chronic waste and disease communications and information at that. The next step that we really kind of went into was sort of looking at outreach. So talking to our partner agencies, stakeholder groups. We certainly aren't the only entity in Wyoming that cares a lot about wildlife. And we want to be sure that we reach out and we're talking to these other folks that we work with about chronic waste and disease. We want to be able to work together on this issue. We want to certainly have support from a lot of these folks that we work with. And we do want to seek out their input and have them engaged in this process as we're looking forward towards management. So for the past several months, we have reached out and had quite a lot of conversations with a lot of these partner agencies, stakeholder groups. We're wrapping that up at this point. And now we're at the point of really bigger, broader public communication. To prepare for that, we have updated and overhauled our website. So this past summer, we actually updated all the information on our website on chronic waste and disease. We put together new information, new recommendations. We did put together literature from chronic waste and disease studies in Wyoming. And we really drastically updated our chronic waste and disease maps. And so we now have maps on our website that are real time. We update them as we find new cases so that that information is readily available to our public. And anybody who wants to can go and look up and see where CWD exists and plan accordingly as they're looking to go hunting somewhere. We're also going to be reaching out in the next couple months really broadly. You know, we're going to start doing some press releases. We're going to start having a lot of communications as we do season setting and other public meetings. And as we continue to proceed down the road towards management, we'll probably be having a lot of focused public meetings, particularly in areas where management might occur. Now, certainly this is not a sort of one and done communication strategy. Every single step within that, every kind of group within that is going to be long-term communication. So we're going to continue working, of course, internally with our own folks. We're going to continue working with our partner agencies, our stakeholder groups, other people who are really passionate about wildlife management and working together with those folks. And we're going to continue talking to our public. So communications is going to be a long-term, ongoing strategy. And I know that this has been shared with the commission before. I'm not going to go in depth into our full messaging, PowerPoint, or anything along those lines, but the message that we have generated and the message that we are sharing about chronic wasting disease is really that we do believe CWD is a deer management concern. And we do believe that this is something that needs to be considered when we're looking at deer management. We are not ignoring elk or moose. We know that those animals also get this disease. And we do believe that if prevalence gets high enough, we would see impact in those populations as well. Right now, it appears that the distribution and disease is much higher in deer. We're seeing impacts in deer. Deer are probably somewhat of the driver of this disease in our state, so right now our focus is on deer. We do want to set up realistic expectations when we're talking about chronic waste and disease. And one of those expectations is that once the disease is firmly established, we don't currently have the tools to eradicate it. We're not going to eliminate this disease, and we do need to be sure that as we're talking to folks, we are very upfront and open about that, and don't set up the expectation that we're going to find a magic tool and it's going to be gone. This is a long-term commitment, and it's not going to go away. And so our efforts on chronic waste and disease management are going to be looking at reducing the impact. We're looking at harm reduction. We're looking at trying to find ways to make our populations resilient and robust in the face of this disease. We do believe that chronic wasting disease is causing declines in very select populations in Wyoming. We have data to suggest that that is occurring. But we also do think that the effects of CWD, particularly as prevalence is getting higher, those effects are additive. So populations are dynamic. You know, there are a lot of things going on. Hank mentioned this. You know, chronic wasting disease is not the only thing that impacts those populations. You know, we're looking at habitat, we're looking at weather, we're looking at predation. All those things are coming together to kind of create the result that we see in a population. So that can make it really difficult for us, as Hank mentioned, to figure out Why are we seeing prevalence decreasing? Is it because we had some drought years and we had actually a drop in the population? Did that drop the prevalence? Does it have something to do with how we're actually managing those populations? Does it have to do with predation? There are a lot of factors going on. But certainly we do see that mule deer in particular are struggling across the West. And we have populations of mule deer that are struggling in the absence of chronic wasting disease. And we do know that CWD at high prevalence can cause some pretty negative impacts in populations. And so the question is how much CWD is going to tip the scales and really cause a population to struggle. And I think also recognizing that there are multiple factors that are working together in a population is important, because we probably aren't going to see the same thing in every population with chronic wasting disease. We're probably going to see different things because not all populations are experiencing the same thing across the state. So just kind of recognizing that there are a lot of factors at play here. The other expectation we really need to set for our agency, for the public, is that anything we're going to do is going to be long-term. It's going to be a long-term commitment, and the results from management are also probably going to be long-term. So we're not looking at implementing a management strategy and expecting to see a result in the next year. We don't think that's going to happen. We think that with management, if we can find successful management, results may still take years to decades in order to really become apparent. And this is difficult. This is incredibly difficult. And probably one of the best ways to think of it is something along the lines of habitat management. You're putting in an investment for the future, and you're hoping to see that future pay off. I think the other thing that we certainly do have to recognize and discuss is that chronic wasting disease is impacting hunting in Wyoming. We do know that from the populations that have experienced some amount of decline, where there may be less hunting opportunity, but certainly we see that in our discussions with hunters that call us up because they've harvested a positive animal and have to decide whether or not they're going to consume that animal. This disease does impact hunting in Wyoming, and unfortunately it's going to continue to impact hunting in Wyoming. And so our goal is certainly to see what we can do to try and minimize that. And then I think one of the most important lessons we learned, and I feel like for me at least coming into this, and I can't tell you I wasn't here 30 years ago, but for me looking at this, I think it was probably the hardest lesson for us to learn, is that the impact of chronic wasting disease is not measured in years. This disease is measured in decades. And that makes it really difficult to talk about and communicate and message. And that made it really difficult for us to really look at this disease. You know, back in 1985, when we saw our first positive in a free-ranging animal, we knew very little about this disease. We didn't really know what it was going to do. We didn't really know what impact it was going to have. And so we started monitoring this disease and watching it. And, you know, 5 years later, we didn't see any impact. You know, we didn't see any difference. And 10 years later, we didn't see any impact. We didn't see any difference. And unfortunately, we've now learned that at least 30 years later, we do. And that's what's so difficult about chronic wasting disease, is nothing is fast. It's slow moving. It's a little bit insidious, and it kind of creeps up on you and lulls you into this false sense of security that everything's fine until it's not. And so I guess in recognizing nothing happens quickly with CWD, we didn't get where we are quickly. We aren't going to fix it quickly either. Nothing happens quickly. This is going to be a long-term commitment. This is going to be a deep commitment, and it's going to have to be a commitment from our agency. It's going to have to be a commitment from our commission, and it's going to have to be a commitment from our public. We don't have the answers. We don't have a truly validated management strategy that we know is always going to work. We are going to have to start to try some things. And we're going to have to start looking at ways to try things so that we can truly evaluate them. But that is something that we really need to think about when we're talking about chronic wasting disease and messaging, is we aren't looking at tomorrow. We aren't looking at hunting for next year. We're looking for future generations. We are looking for deer for the future, and we have to be able to take that long view, because that's where the impacts occur, and it's slow. So that can be a very difficult concept, I think, to message around, and sometimes it's really difficult for us to get worked up over it when it's maybe not going to happen for another 10 to 20 years. But we do need to think in the future when it comes to this. So, I know that was a lot on communication, and that is a big part of what we're doing now, because we don't think that we will be successful or effective without communication. And I wanted to go heavily into the messaging and kind of reiterate some of that stuff, because we are working towards management, and we've been doing a lot to put ourselves into a position where we're able to do management. But the reality is the management strategies that look most promising for chronic wasting disease are not easy, and they're not going to be popular. And so we do have to kind of prepare ourselves as we're thinking about this and really think about the big picture and the impact of this disease when we're talking about what it might actually take in order to manage the disease. So as we've moved forward to look at how will we manage for chronic wasting disease, when we look at the fact that we don't have a definitive strategy we know is going to work, that initial management is going to have to be somewhat experimental, the reality is no state, no jurisdiction is going to solve this problem by themselves. Nobody is going to find the answer, manage this disease alone. This is going to be a big effort that's going to happen nationwide. So we started looking at whether or not we could start from a regional approach. We recognize that there are some differences in wildlife management and wildlife populations between, the East and the Midwest and the West. We certainly see different scenarios. So perhaps looking at least regionally where we might have similar habitat types, similar wildlife populations, starting to work together regionally might be the best way to start approaching chronic wasting disease. So one of the really big projects that we've been working on over the past year and a half is developing these recommendations for adaptive management of chronic wasting disease in the West. And this has been a pretty big effort. It was a small sort of ad hoc group of people consisting of some pretty great chronic wasting disease experts that got together and worked on developing this document. We took this document to WAFWA, ran this document through the WAFWA Wildlife Health Committee, the WAFWA Mule Deer Working Group, did further fine-tuning, editing, and actual modification of this document. And actually this went before the directors at the winter WAFWA meeting and was signed off and approved January 6th. So we finally have an actual final draft and final copy, and this is an official WAFWA document. And it's a pretty valuable document, I think. It's not a prescription. It doesn't tell us what exactly we have to do, but what it does do is give us some guidance on how we would look at approaching management for chronic wasting disease. And the main premise of this document is really looking at adaptive management and ways that we can learn from management over time. We don't have the definitive answer, so we're going to have to try some things. But it's not simple trial and error. It's not a matter of applying a strategy and just seeing what happens. It's a matter of actually really trying to look strategically, systematic, hypothesis-based, scientific approach to evaluating management strategies, which means finding the right set of circumstances and data that you're going to need to actually evaluate whether a management strategy is successful. So it's not just trial and error. There's a fair bit of thought and work that needs to go into this if we want to truly find a management strategy and determine if it really is effective. The very basic design of this is a before-after control impact design. Basically what we would do is find matched pairs of population units, and one would be a control where management of that population continued as normal, and one would be a treatment where an experimental management strategy would be applied. At the barest of bare minimum, you would want to be able to measure prevalence with really good sample sizes before you implemented management, and you would want to be able to evaluate prevalence after you implemented management. You also are going to need some good demographic data for those populations. We're going to need to have some population estimates, buck-doe ratios, doe-fawn ratios. We're going to have some of that other information. And this document kind of outlines some criteria for inclusion. What are you really going to need in order to actually consider if a population unit can realistically be included and evaluated robustly? But the important thing I think to recognize is that the recommendation is at the barest of bare minimum. You apply that management for 5 years. Ideally, you would apply it for 10 years to truly evaluate whether it's effective. Because as I said, nothing happens quickly with chronic wasting disease. So that's going to be difficult. That's a big commitment, and that's a long time to look at some of this management. And these management strategies are not necessarily easy. So in addition to outlining how to set the stage to evaluate management and those minimum criteria and things to think about, this document also outlines 3 potential management strategies that are worth evaluating. These are by no means the only management strategies that are out there. There are other things that could be tried, certainly. But these 3 strategies are strategies that, based on some of the literature, based on some of what has been done in other areas, look promising. And additionally, they're strategies that may potentially have capacity for the long-term implementation. And may be more sustainable to try and do in the long term. So I just give you the caveat, this is not the only strategies, but these are 3 strategies that are recommended to evaluate to see whether or not they could be effective. First strategy is looking at just a very simple harvest management. So when it comes to managing our wildlife populations, harvest is one of our most powerful management tools. And is there a way that we can utilize harvest in order to help us manage for this disease? So it's thought that male deer are more likely than female deer to have CWD. Their prevalence is higher. And so if you can actually focus on that portion of the population that is more likely to have the disease, has more disease, can we reduce prevalence? There's some data out there to suggest that maybe animals harvested a little bit later might be more likely to be positive. So are there things we can do with timing of our harvest that might change the outcome for chronic wasting disease? And then certainly we know that during the rut there's a lot of animal-to-animal contact that occurs. And we assume that that also means there's a lot of disease transmission that may occur during the rut. And if so, if we were to maybe move our harvest to after the rut, would we be able to remove animals that were recently infected a lot earlier? So really this strategy is looking at, can we harvest sort of the proportion of the population most likely to have CWD? Can we move timing of harvest? And would that actually have an outcome? And this is not a prescription, so we could choose to do one of those things. We could choose to do both in combination. The caveat that I give you, and that's in this document, is also that looking at doe harvest is worth attention too. So while we seem to see that differentiation where males have higher prevalence than females, we do know that that's not always necessarily true. And we do know that in Wyoming we have areas where perhaps we don't have that difference. And we certainly wonder if as prevalence gets higher, you might not see that difference as much. You might see a more uniform distribution. So consideration of your prevalence, consideration of female harvest is also worth your attention. So again, these are options that can be considered. The next strategy is looking at, again, harvest, but trying to really target your harvest. So basically this would be utilizing your surveillance program, utilizing the data that we get from surveillance, trying to get really good, precise locations of where we have positive animals being harvested, and take that information to try and really target our harvest towards those areas, those hot spots where we seem to have a lot of CWD. You know, when we talk about 35% prevalence in Hunt Area 15, the reality is that's not necessarily uniform across the landscape. Chronic wasting disease can be really patchy. So you may have a group of deer that has 40% prevalence, and you may have another social group that has 5% prevalence. And there's a lot of data to suggest this disease is really transmitted within social groups quite a lot. So it's not uniform across the landscape. So can we find ways to identify those areas where we do have a lot of disease and go in and try and really focus some harvest in those areas and try and kind of cull that out of the population? And the third strategy is really just looking at congregation of deer, congregation of cervid species. We do know when we have any type of animal in high density and high concentration, that facilitates disease transmission. And so in these areas, particularly looking at areas of artificial concentration, do we have areas that have kind of consistently available food, water, minerals, something like that, that are causing animals to congregate when they wouldn't normally? And would that actually lead to more contamination in the environment, more disease transmission? So can we identify those areas and actually go out and spend some time trying to mitigate that? Can we do some things to prevent them from congregating artificially? And can we get them to maybe spread out and disperse a little bit? And if so, would we be able to reduce prevalence by doing that? So again, I'm not going in depth totally into the document, and I would encourage you all to read that document. It's available on the website, the Wildlife Health Committee page. That's just a very broad overview. The goal is not a prescription on exactly what to do. The goal is here are the options, and if you're going to do it, some really good recommendations on how to do it. The thought being that if we follow these minimum criteria and we collect these minimum data, and maybe Colorado does that, and maybe Alberta does that, can we actually maybe speed up this learning process to figure out how to manage for chronic wasting disease? If we have multiple folks kind of working together doing this, and we have at least a minimum set of data that's comparable, can we expedite that learning process and try and find a solution sooner? Because a 10-year commitment's a long time, and if we're doing that in one area in Wyoming and it's up to us to find the answer, that could take a really long time. So really looking at that regional approach and trying to share data and share the burden of trying to find the answer is the ultimate goal of kind of trying to work towards this. So now that we have this document out, it has been approved by WAFWA. Our CWD management team is taking a really good, close, hard look at this. We aren't at the point where we're deciding on management strategies. We think that needs to be a bigger conversation with a lot more people. What we are really doing is looking at those minimum criteria. So do we have some areas, some populations that are going to meet those minimum criteria, and where in our state would be good areas for us to consider trying to implement some sort of a management? And then we're going to certainly take that step forward and do a lot of communication and a lot of discussions to talk to people about which management strategies we might want to consider trying. So that's not the only project we've been working on, although I have to say that has been quite a lot of work and a lot of effort to get that to completion. We also did some work this year through AFWA, and very thankfully Director Talbot also really helped us to get wildlife disease listed as a national conservation need. And as a result, it became eligible for grants through AFWA. So we actually co-wrote a grant with Colorado Parks and Wildlife through this multi-state conservation grant program, and we were lucky enough to be successful to get funding, about $100,000, to move forward with another project looking at chronic wasting disease management. And this is to look at available long-term data that we already have in hand to try and see if we can find some information on chronic wasting disease management. And as of right now, we have preliminary agreements with 4 states and 1 Canadian province, which really encompasses all of the areas across the West that have a long history or longer history of chronic wasting disease. To take all of that data and put it together, and we will hire actually a researcher to work with us to actually help synthesize and go through that data and analyze that data. And really at the heart of it all, what we're just trying to do is to figure out what we can learn from what we already have. So we actually collect a lot of data. You know, our agency collects a ton of data every year. We are looking at our populations. We are tracking those populations. We are looking at buck-doe ratios, doe-fawn ratios, management. And of course, as Hank presented, we're tracking chronic wasting disease as well. We have a lot of data. And we've had chronic wasting disease for 30 years, as has Colorado. There's a lot of data that we already have in hand. This data is not perfect. It's messy data. There's some error in it. There's caveats that come with it. But there's probably something to be learned there, particularly if we could combine data from multiple different areas and start to look for that. And a lot of us have really recognized for a long time that there's a lot of information there that needs to be sorted out. We're having a hard time finding the time to sit down ourselves and do it. So with this grant, we're going to be able to work with somebody to help us put all that data together and analyze that So we're waiting right now for the funding to actually appear, and hopefully that happens sometime in the next month. And then we're going to start moving forward pretty quickly. So this will be a 2-year project that we'll be working on, and we do hope to keep you guys informed and up to date as we move forward and get some information out of this project. So you'll be hearing about this again. So those 2 projects are really the biggest projects that we've got going on, because there's a lot of work, especially when you're doing that big regional collaboration and you have a lot of people working together. There's been a lot of work. We certainly have a few other things going on, a few other things that are in the works on chronic wasting disease. We are working on a study looking at shedding of chronic wasting disease in elk and elk genetics in CWD at our captive research facility. We're doing a big statewide mule deer genetics project looking at genetics in mule deer statewide and chronic wasting disease. We're working with the University of Wyoming on that. We've provided thousands of genetic samples from mule deer across Wyoming to try and see what we can learn on a very big, broad scale about chronic wasting disease. On a smaller scale, we are doing some more local projects looking at our Bates Hole and our Sheep Mountain mule deer populations. These aren't big, epic research projects. These aren't pie in the sky, I guess, academic evaluations, but actually they are critical data. These 2 populations are in our core endemic chronic wasting disease area, and they're in areas where we have actually very little data on deer movement. And so if we're going to try and understand this disease and try and figure out what is it really doing across the landscape, what is it doing to our populations, we really need to understand those populations. So this is some pretty critical data that we're collecting that we hope will help us as we move forward trying to understand the disease and as we consider management actions. Finally, we are in the process of writing up our chronic wasting disease vaccine study. That study is finally complete as of this fall. Unfortunately, that vaccine is not promising, but certainly every step we make is worth evaluating. And there is actually some really interesting things to be learned from what we saw in that vaccine. And the path to success is paved with failure, and every single step that we take puts us forward, and we learn something, we move forward. So it's going to be really valuable actually for us to publish this, get this out in the literature, and we hope it helps direct some future efforts for chronic wasting disease vaccines. And then just to sort of finish things out, a very, very quick and dirty overview of some recent chronic wasting disease research. I can't review everything that's come out in the last year. There's such a huge volume of it, but I guess here are a few things, highlights. A couple of studies that we actually worked with and collaborated on that have come out. One study looking at chronic wasting disease excretion of prion in feces and urine of animals, and actually the animals for that study and all those samples were animals that were held at our research facility in Sabile Canyon. And, certainly did find that there is shedding, quite a lot of shedding that occurs in feces, less shedding in urine, but that's happening in animals that are apparently healthy and asymptomatic. Another study that we worked with the National Park Service on that we just got published this year was actually looking at genetics of elk and chronic wasting disease, and we looked at populations with a long history of CWD, populations without CWD to see what were we seeing. And at least the data from that study suggests that we may already be seeing a shift in genetics in our elk populations with chronic wasting disease. And that shift is towards a genotype that seems to prolong that incubation period for chronic wasting disease, which is really interesting because, of course, our prevalence, as Hank showed, is not nearly as high as it is in deer. So it's very interesting to see that that may be occurring in some of our elk populations. So I think when we talk about genetics, it's easy to start getting really excited and think maybe it is the answer, and to think that maybe it's the solution and maybe natural selection will take care of things for us. But there was another paper that came out that found that as CWD passed through these animals that have these genetics with a prolonged incubation period, that actually may result in emergence of a new strain of CWD. So that's where you kind of have to look at that caveat with the genetics, because every time we shift strains of CWD and every time we move that strain, we worry about whether we're increasing the likelihood that that strain may be able to jump species. So that certainly is something to consider as we're talking about genetics and genetic selection. I don't know if that will happen or won't happen, but that is something that needs to be considered. There was a paper that came out that probably caused a lot of concern looking at experimental transmission of chronic wasting disease to pigs. And at least in that scenario, they were able to get some transmission of CWD to pigs, although it was pretty low. The level of prion that was there was pretty low. But that certainly has led to a lot of concern, particularly when it comes to feral swine. And a lot of our country is facing major issues with feral swine. And if you had feral swine overlapping with cervids, and if CWD were to actually go into swine, again, you're looking at, is this disease going to move through another species? And every time it moves through another species, does that make it more likely to go to humans? So that's certainly the concern with that study. I don't think it's cause for panic at this point, but it is pretty interesting, and I'm sure there'll be more research on this moving forward. I think the study that's probably gotten the most attention in the last year, at least what I've seen most on in the media, is a study looking at chronic wasting disease transmission to macaques. And this is an ongoing study. I think it's the University of Calgary that's doing this, and they're looking at potential for transmission to macaques through blood transfusion, through wounds, and through actually eating infected meat. And the study is not yet complete, it's still ongoing, but they did present their preliminary results in May at the International Prion Conference in Scotland. And their presentation was that, you know, they did see transmission of chronic wasting disease to macaques after ingestion of infected meat. And this has certainly, I think, stirred the pot quite a bit and led to a lot of concern because macaques, at least from a research animal setting, are kind of the closest research animal to humans. And there was a lot of concern that this may mean that this disease could be transmitted to humans. The study's not yet done. It hasn't been peer-reviewed. It hasn't been published. They're still ongoing. There are still a number of factors in that study that haven't actually been evaluated. But results from this study did actually push some of our human health agencies to strengthen their recommendations regarding CWD and human consumption of CWD-positive meat, and concern over whether there really is a potential for CWD infection in humans. And I think I give you the caveat that, to our knowledge, chronic wasting disease right now is not a human disease. We've never seen a case in humans. We work with our health departments. We track this disease over time. We've never seen any evidence that this disease is currently able to be transmitted to humans. But the body of research that we have suggests that it's not impossible. There's a strong species barrier. It doesn't really want to go to humans, but it doesn't mean that at some point it can't go to humans. And because of that, it does seem prudent to really work to minimize this disease in our wildlife populations and minimize human exposure to CWD. And that's where I think it's important for us to take the big picture and look at the long view with this disease. I don't think that this is cause for panic. I don't think the sky is falling. I don't think this is the beginning of the zombie apocalypse. But we should be paying attention to this, and we do need to think about this in the broader scale, and we probably need to think about the bigger picture as we're moving forward with chronic wasting disease, because I know that changing timing of our harvest or increasing harvest of our bucks or things like that, those are not easy strategies. They're not easy. But where is our responsibility to really try and look at minimizing this disease, minimizing exposure to this disease? Because it's not considered a human disease at this point, and we'd sure like to keep it that way. We want to keep this as a disease that doesn't go to humans. And we can't predict the future. I don't know what will happen, but we do know that the scenario that probably makes this disease most likely to go through a new species is to have widespread disease, is to have high prevalence, and is to have a lot of exposure to the disease. So with that, it is really worthwhile for us to look at whether we can find some ways to manage or limit this disease. And I can give you no guarantees. I can't tell you we'll find the answer. But I do think it's worth it for us to give it a try and really give it an honest, good effort to see whether we can find some options to manage this disease and hope that we get better tools in the future. So with that really uplifting conclusion, I would be happy to take any questions.
Questions for Mary?
Mr. President,
Yes, Pat?
Mary, help me give I think most of us know that the chronic wasting disease 101, I mean, it's caused by prions or prions. They're not alive. They're virtually impossible to kill. They survive in the soil, they survive in the grasses, they survive in animals, they survive in the central nervous system of dead animals. They, I mean, you can't autoclave them, you can't, I mean, because they're not alive, they're virtually impossible to kill. There's no vaccine for them. They're passed readily between animal to animal via saliva, via feces, via anything else I'm missing?
Possibly urine and carcasses.
So it's just, I think this is one of the greatest threats to our wildlife populations, particularly our deer populations that exist. I mean, it's there with habitat destruction. It's just a horribly depressing issue that's currently not scientifically solvable, correct? There are studies out there that say if we don't, if there is not some solution, Wyoming will have no huntable elk population within 100 years. There are deer studies, I think, out there saying that some of our deer herds will be extirpated within 40 to 50 years. Is that roughly accurate?
Well, I guess President Culver, members of the commission, there are studies out there that suggest that. I think you have to take that with a grain of salt. Now, I agree chronic wasting disease is a significant concern, and it worries me. Is it truly going to extirpate populations? Are we going to have no elk in 100 years? I guess from what we've seen over the past 30 years, I don't know if that is truly going to be the case, but I do think from what we've seen, we are going to see significant impacts to our population, which may be significant reductions, which may be a change in the age class or age structure of our populations. And I do think that that will be a concern. I can't predict the future. I mean, there could be a scenario where a population is truly extirpated, but because of that dynamic nature of populations and all the factors that they're experiencing and movement of them, I'm not sure. I think those are worst case scenarios. I don't know if they'll come to pass.
Okay. I guess I just throw that out there I mean, I think this commission, future commissions, the department, not only in Wyoming but other places, are going to have to make some really hard calls. The only management strategies I heard you discuss that may have some chance of success is basically would have a dramatic impact on our mature buck deer. The general populace, I don't think, is going to like us killing off the monster 4-points and those breeding age deer that everyone covets and make particularly mule deer such a special species. And so it's just really hard calls coming for everybody that is involved in wildlife management. But I really want to commend you, Mary. Think how far you've moved the needle in just the last couple of years. I mean, there's some significant stuff going on with regard to CWD that I don't think was going on a couple of years ago. So thank you for leading that charge. And Hank, thank you. That's amazing. I mean, I would encourage you to, you have 3 suggestions. Let's do one of them in Wyoming, even if it's unpopular. I mean, let's try to develop some tools to manage CWD. So, such as you're just beginning that process, I understand that, but I mean, I'd urge you to communicate with our department and find those similarly situated populations, and let's try to do something. I mean, someone's got to start sometime and develop an effective management tool. And if it takes 10 years of funding and 10 years of effort, then that's what we need to do. I tend to believe that you've accurately portrayed that. Thank you.
I almost feel like we need to, I know we're here shortly, we need to break so that we can set up the room for our joint meeting with the Department of Ag and the Board of Ag. But I almost feel like we need to spend some more time on this issue. Mary, are you going to be here tomorrow?
President Culver, I was not planning to be, but if necessary, I can be.
Mary, just tell him no.
Let me ask you a couple of quick questions before we let you go. So is there any research being done currently on the role of our native large predators as far as CWD? What happens to those prions as they pass through a wolf or a grizzly bear or a lion? Is anybody doing that research?
Yeah, President Culver, members of the commission, that's a really good question. There is research going on. There's been some that's been done. They've looked at least coyotes and passage through coyotes. So there was a study that did find that they could detect prion in the feces from a coyote for about 3 days after it had ingested an infected carcass. So there was some research there. I do know that there is a sort of long-term ongoing study looking at chronic wasting disease being fed to mountain lions. I don't know if they're looking at passage through mountain lions, but I know they're looking at feeding mountain lions CWD. And certainly there's been a lot of population studies that have looked at kind of the big picture in a population and looked at chronic wasting disease and looked at predators. And there is data to suggest that predators do selectively prey on CWD-infected animals. Most of the research is really mountain lions. We haven't had areas with significant overlap of CWD and wolves to investigate whether that's true, but there have been some studies looking at modeling in wolves that did suggest that wolves may be a really good thing in the face of CWD, and they may even be more effective than mountain lions at sort of selectively removing those CWD-infected animals, and even earlier than maybe we would recognize it. You know, when they get to look physically sick, they're really advanced in the disease. But we certainly have learned, even working with animals in captivity, we can detect behavioral changes in the disease long before we ever see those physical changes. And it does seem like predators may actually be able to do that as well and remove some of those animals. So there's some research that suggests that that'll be interesting. And certainly as we see CWD move into areas where we have overlapping wolf populations, that's going to be an area of good research, I think.
Thank you. I have a ton more questions. I'll talk to you sometime one-on-one. I really appreciate your presentation today, Mary.
Sure.
And with that, we will let you not be here tomorrow then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So with that, let's take a break and get the room set up, and we will meet back here at 3 o'clock.
Doing good. How are you?
Have you ever been around, right there, till it's green, just leave it on. There you go. Just push it once and it's, there you go.
Hey there, how are you?
Good, how are you? Kendall Roberts.
Okay.
I think at last year's meeting.
Okay, if we can get everybody to not talk too close to the mic. Sorry about that.
Turn that off.
That's how I get their attention. There you go, that gets them. Okay, we'd like to welcome everybody to the joint meeting between the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission and the Board of Agriculture. We'll start out with introductions. I'll start. I'm Keith Culver. I'm currently the president of the commission, and I'm from District 6. That's Crook, Weston, and Niobrara counties. Jim?
I'm Jim Rogers. I'm the chairman of the board this year of the Board of Ag. I represent Albany, Carbon, and Sweetwater counties.
I'm David Royale, District 5, Region 5. I represent Bighorn County, Park County, Washtenaw County, and Hot Springs County.
Kendall Roberts, out of Cheyenne, representing on the Southeastern Youth Board member for Board of Agriculture.
Hi there, Pat Crank. I'm from Cheyenne. I'm District 1, I believe, and I represent Laramie County, Platte County, Albany County, and Goshen County.
Mark Anselmi from Rock Springs, representing with the Game and Fish, Sweetwater, Carbon, and Albany.
Bob Sims, out of Evanston, I represent Uena, Lincoln, Sweetwater, and Teton County. Board of Ag. John Hanson, I'm out of Rollins, out west of Washington State. Mike Schmidt, the Game and Fish Commissioner for District 3. Thank you. Teton Sutler, I'm Gavin Chief Brown, I represent District 7 on the Board of Ag. Duty Game Fish Commission, District 4, Sheridan, Johnson County. Mike Riley, Burlington, Northwest District.
Janet Ginter, Board of Ag, District 1, which is Laramie County, the eastern part of Laramie County, and a small part of Goshen County.
Galen Bird, Commissioner for District 7, Dentrona, Converse, and Fremont counties, who I represent.
I'm Doug Miyamoto, Director of the Department of Agriculture.
Scott Talbot, Director of Game and Fish.
Okay, was that Jim? You want to? Okay.
Well, the Board of Ag will go first. Our presenters will be Chris Wickman, Justin Williams, and Joe Budd, and they're going to talk to us about funding for the wolf depredation, prairie dog update, and the wild horse management. So if those gentlemen could come forth, we will keep it going.
I didn't see me up here.
Just Chris? Oh, no, no, no.
Well, you're here now.
Mr. President, Commissioners, Board of Ag members, I'm Chris Wickman. I'm the manager of the Natural Resources and Policy Division with the Department of Ag, and I'm going to give you a little update on wild horse management. And we've been doing, overseeing or looking at what we could do different with wild horses, and it's 2018, and I'm really trying to be positive that we can see some differences with the BLM and wild horse management, but what we see is basically the same. Just to give you an idea of where we're at, the limiting factor for wild horse management isn't the management or gathering of horses. It's actually what do you do with the horses after they're gathered. There is no long-term or short-term holding facilities that can take the horses that are out there. We were told last year that there was about 2,000 available spaces for long-term holding for horses. So you cannot take more than 2,000 horses off the range if you only have 2,000 places to put those horses. So that's our limiting factor. That hasn't changed. Out of the 80-some million dollars the BLM has in their budget for horse management, I think 60% of that, or no, 60 million of that goes towards some kind of long-term or short-term holding for horses. So that's what we're up against. It's an issue of what do we do with these horses? How do we manage them? Current management isn't working on the range. You don't have to see, if you go to Nevada, you actually see how the ecosystem has changed because of wild horses' impacts. So I'll give you some numbers of where we're at currently, and every one of our HMAs in the state is over objective. So herd management areas, HMAs, we have a set appropriate management levels, AMLs, that the BLM is supposed to manage to. So it's a range. You have a low AML and a high AML. And when they gather, they try to gather to the low number. So these are their estimates, and we have provided information that they grossly underestimate how many horses are actually there. And we'll have an example. So good news, we had a gather last fall, on the Salt Wells, Adobe Town, and the Divide Basin HMAs. Their estimate for populations on there before the gather happened was 2,300. They gathered 2,000 horses off of there and removed 2,000. If they gathered to 2,000, gathered and removed 2,000, they brought it down to low AML, which was 1,300 horses for low AML. So we had 3,200 at minimum horses out there. There's still a lot more horses than we have. So that was the first actual gather we had that wasn't court ordered in the state in probably, I think, 3 years. And we have one court ordered on the checkerboard for the Adobe Town Salt Wells to gather all the horses off of the checkerboard lands. This wasn't that. This was an actual gather. So we have a couple things that we have issues with. One is the population estimates are underestimating what's actually on the lands. And then we still have the issue of gathering those horses as they leave the HMAs. A lot of those don't have fences, so they're already off in different places. The other, let's say, good news is in the fall of 2017, BLM approved another gather to occur for this probably fall, winter of 2018. That's the Red Desert Complex, which is the Green Mountain area of Lander, and then south of that, which is Stewart Creek and Rawlins. And for that gather, the high AML, so the highest number they're supposed to manage to is 424 horses. There's over 2,600 horses that they estimate out there. And that's not an actual count. Their estimate is based on the last time they gathered horses. They feel horse populations grow at every 20%. So that's how they got their estimate of not gathering for the last probably 7 or 8 years out there. So that 2,600 is probably closer to 4,000 or more horses out there. And we're actually seeing severe damage to riparian areas. Horses aren't moving anymore. We're seeing impacts to probably wildlife on the HMAs. An example of impacts that ag is seeing on the Green Mountain complex. Now, Green Mountain's only supposed to have 300 horses. They have 1,200 on their estimate. We're thinking there's probably closer to 2,500 on there. But we have allotments that says let-on dates, that says agriculture producers cannot go on to that allotment or that pasture if they meet a criteria of forage level. So if it goes below 4 inches, they cannot turn out their cattle on those pastures. They haven't turned out in those pastures in 2 years because they never get above that, and it's all wild horses. So there's a lot of efforts and a lot of studies that are looking at these. There's 2 things that we have to do is we have to get this estimate correct. Their population estimate census that they do has to be more accurate. And then we have to figure out something of what to do with horses. Adoption used to be a semi relief we used to adopt, I think, around 2,000 horses out of Wyoming alone. We're down to about 150 horses being adopted out of Wyoming. And that was probably a high over the last 2 years too. So adoptions is not the cure for wild horse management. Gathering is not a cure for what they're doing out there. And then using the fertility drugs, which is that PZP, which just slows the reproductive process for a year, isn't the solution. Something has to happen drastically. The Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board last year actually approved the removal of horses and for slaughter. The first time that board has gone to that level, but that is where we're facing what we need to do on the range. So I could stand for any questions, or if you have any questions for it.
Mr. Chairman, Chris, the House put that language in their bill. The Senate did not. Do you know where that sits as far as on the federal level?
I don't. I know President Trump did put it in his budget request for allowing horse slaughter for the clearances of that. The House did. I don't know where it stands at this point.
Mr. Chairman, Chris, there was quite a bit of discussion sometime in the past about lessening the restrictions on adoption as far as how many horses you could adopt and how long you had to keep them and all of that type of stuff. Has there been any more discussion on that?
I think that's brought up a lot in the discussion of potential options, especially with the horse sanctuaries. You know, because right now, once it's the property of a person who adopts them, they have to keep them, I think, for 3 years. And then the BLM still keeps track of those horses over time. So yeah, there is some options to reduce that, so to allow more people potential to do it. There's actually a proposal that came out, and then that advisory board talked about it, was actually paying people to take a horse. There was a pilot program several years ago, over 10 years ago, that went almost that far to say, you know, that we will give you some monies to take the horse. They'll be under the kind of timeline of 3 years of kind of maintaining the horse before they turn full ownership over to them. And then they could have, you know, personal property. They can do whatever they want with them. But those discussions occur, but what we don't see is any change in management from the BLM or anywhere else. It's an emotional issue for a lot of folks.
Back in the, I'm trying to remember, 2003, 2004 timeframe, John Etchpair was head of Department of Ag, Dave Freenthal was governor, but they actually obtained a consent decree to remove wild horses to the lower limit of the AMLs, and all the AMLs. And so I know that consent decree is expired, but have you explored that with the AG's office? If they
Absolutely. So that consent decree ended in 2013, and the governor of Wyoming went to litigation, tried to sue the Interior for the HMAs that we are currently over AML on. So at the time, there were 7 herd management areas that were over, and that the governor tried to litigate on them. They came back by saying, until you can prove horses are affecting other things, not livestock, because that's an end game with that discussion, but affecting wildlife, affecting rangeland health, those things. Until you can get the data that shows the horses are actually impacting the ecosystems, we're really not interested in redoing the consent decree. So the governor tried, looked at it, and I think at 2015, 16, I think the decision was no, that it didn't go through.
decision with BLM or with the court system?
No, I think it went, I think even the Supreme Court, and I think, I don't know, I believe the Supreme Court even, Wyoming Supreme Court, took the case and basically made that assertion of, until you can prove that you're affecting the ecosystem, and before you can, you know, make changes. And I think that's really the key, is the Department of Ag was given $250,000, I think 3 years ago, to do research on wild horses. And one of the things they wanted to do is look at impacts horses are having on wildlife behavior, sage grouse, ecosystem, rangeland health. And so we've got a project right now through the University of Wyoming that's looking at the block federal of Adobe Town. They've collared 30 horses to date in 2017, and they're using GPS collars to see the areas that they're using, what kind of foods, what kind of competition. They have a grad student out there with those different things to observe how wildlife are avoiding, where the horses are at. So we're getting some data that actually will start showing that horses are impacting wildlife and rangeland health out there, which is really the key for change in management, not a livestock issue, but more of a wildlife ecosystem issue. So we're 1 year in. I think Derek Scasta, UW, gave a presentation, and we're finding that horses are moving a lot more than we thought. Their horses are going from that Rollins herd area into Colorado and back. Horses, of course, are going across into the checkerboard where they weren't, translocated or removed from, and so and then they're locating, the exact areas that they're impacting. So we're starting to get data, and I think that's really the key for the state of Wyoming. Once the state can prove that they affect sage grouse or wildlife movements or something, I think then the state would have another chance of getting some kind of litigation or consent decree out of that.
Have you pondered, there are wild horses places where the BLM doesn't recognize them. I mean, Laramie Peak's a great example. There's all kinds of wild horses on Laramie Peak. So have you pondered going that way? I mean, maybe you could obtain some relief outside of the AMLs?
Taking horses outside the AML or outside the HMAs?
HMAs, excuse me.
They do have a horse sanctuary program now where the landowner can provide his ranch to house wild horses. And they have those in Centennial. There's one over by Lander, I believe, and Cheyenne had one. And the BLM basically pays you to feed horses on those lands.
These are wild horses, free-ranging horses, just running on private land outside of the HMAs.
And I think the problem with that is at some point someone's going to call on those to remove all those horses, because those horses, if they're not property of private individuals or the federal government, goes under the livestock board's purview. Just someone has to make that call. So there's probably options for people to take horses. Of course, most of those are going to want some kind of funding to house horses, but to put them on other federal lands or other BLM permitted lands probably wouldn't go well with the permittees and those folks. It's an ongoing issue. I don't see a solution anytime soon until they follow the Wild Horse and Burro Act that actually says you have 3 tries to adopt a horse. If they don't get adopted, they can be sold or let for slaughter or for property, and then people can slaughter them. The law is clear on how to handle excess horses. It's just those options are not funded by the federal government, or they don't have the will to do that. So the actual law, if we followed it, we wouldn't have a problem. We could get rid of and manage wild horses on the range. It's just, again, the emotional side and the political side of it has gotten away with the management on the ground.
Any other questions for Chris? No, thank you, Chris, appreciate it.
I think Doug or Joe wants to do the prairie dogs.
Mr. Chairman, members, my name is Joe Budd. With the department, I'm one of our policy analysts in the Natural Resource Policy Division. Just going to give you a quick update on prairie dogs. And for the department, 95% of our work on prairie dogs probably revolves around the Thunder Basin, so that's really what I'm going to update you on today. But 2 major developments in the last year probably for the Thunder Basin and our work in prairie dogs. One would be that plague came to the Thunder Basin. There was over 100,000 acres, at least estimated, as far as number of prairie dog colony acres out there, and the plague ran through that and hit those pretty hard. So that really has kind of changed the game as far as increasing numbers of prairie dogs out there and how that affects permittees and landowners and those types of things. The other big thing that happened last year was that the U.S. Forest Service put together a working group to look at black-tailed prairie dog management on the Thunder Basin and see if there's room for any kind of collaborative solutions, especially in that arena. And so Game and Fish was part of that, Weed and Pest, Department of Ag, conservation districts, essentially a group of government cooperators that met 6 times over the past year to try and look at solutions. And that was run by the Ruckles House. They facilitated that work. And in the end, there was a report that was done that came out with 12 major recommendations for prairie dog management on the Thunder Basin. Anything from revising the 2015 strategy that was based on the Thunder Basin plan, all the way down to just better communication and some Forest Service accountability on the issue of prairie dogs. But obviously it's going to be an issue for us in the future. It's been an issue in the past. It's one that is not easily solved, if you will. But the recommendations that came out of that group were all consensus-based, with one exception, which was the use of anticoagulants and just risk to some of the other species, non-target species. The other major thing that I would say about that group is that it did not include any of the non-governmental organizations, and so you were missing a component from the overall equation. I think that it really does kind of lay some groundwork, and moving into next year, there's no great clarity as to how the Forest Service is going to move forward. I think the Department of Ag has worked very well with Game and Fish in the past, and we're going to continue to do that, I'm sure. So the only other thing I'd mention with regard to prairie dogs is that WDA does work closely with Game and Fish on the black-footed ferret statewide plan, and that is getting closer and closer. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Mr. Chairman, to provide just a little more background on that issue, recently the department's been solicited to engage in further discussions with Forest Service about future management on the Thunder Basin National Grassland for prairie dogs. And what we've offered at this point, I mean, we've been going around for years and years trying to come up with a collaborative process. The current forest plan for the Thunder Basin National Grassland sets a specified number of acres for management for prairie dog habitat. Essentially, that's been the key area of conflict between people that use the Thunder Basin National Grassland for grazing permits and the Forest Service trying to manage for all these prairie dogs. Well, in the meantime, just recently, that population's been impacted fairly heavily with plague. And so the question becomes, for future management of this Forest Service property, are the acreage levels that were set for management still appropriate? A couple of years ago, probably last year or maybe the year before, State Lands, the Game and Fish Department, and the Department of Ag penned a joint letter to Forest Service saying, looking at the political implications, the temperament that's out there right now, we don't feel that the Thunder Basin National Grassland would be an appropriate place to start reintroduction of black-footed ferrets, just because it's so controversial. This was before it plagued out. But the problem that we're having is in the Forest Service plan, it stipulates that Forest Service has to manage to this level for prairie dog. Is it 30,000 acres or?
So there would be different categories is how they've broken it out for colonies of prairie dogs. And the major areas referred to in the forest plan is management area 3.63, which would be black-footed ferret reintroduction habitat. And so it is managed primarily and almost exclusively for prairie dogs, and really is one mega colony, if you will. And so that would be what they call category 1. Then they have category 2 and 3 that go down below that, which are different sizes and different numbers of those that have to exist on the planning unit for the Forest Service, and different acreage targets for those across the entire Thunder Basin National Grassland.
So in the meantime, we've offered technical assistance to Forest Service and said, you know, we have a process within the Department of Ag that's termed a technical review team. And it's a strategy for mediation on natural resource issues, essentially, where we can go out and get some third-party experts to review some existing data and come up with a set of recommendations, because where the Forest Service is landing right now is they're saying, okay, do we need to do a formal amendment to the forest plan, or can we get where we're going just with some policy changes? And so from the Department's of Ag standpoint, we just simply offered to the Forest Service to say, look, we can use our program and have some people come in and look at the existing data that you've got. And are you heading towards your objectives for overall comprehensive resource management on the Thunder Basin grassland? And we can make some recommendations on whether or not we think that there needs to be a full-blown amendment to the Thunder Basin National Grassland Forest Plan to get you where you're going. We've made that offer. They've had some significant staff turnover at the Thunder Basin National Grassland recently. We just met with them last week. And so they will be getting back to us and deciding whether or not they want to take us up on our offer to bring in some third-party review and make some recommendations on what direction to take their forest plan amendment, or whether they have an alternative arrangement that they can come up with to try to bring some resolution. It's just one of these issues that overall natural resource management, I think, is what's called for. And now you don't have as many prairie dogs out there as you once did because of this plague issue. So it seems to me that it might be an appropriate time to reevaluate management overall for the Thunder Basin National Grassland, try to come at it from more of a neutral standpoint and offer some recommendations on what might be in that forest plan to provide for some real and some appropriate management of the grassland, instead of trying to reach this huge goal of occupied acreages for prairie dogs. If the goal is no longer to try to reintroduce black-footed ferrets quickly. So that's where we are today.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just for a moment, certainly the department has been very engaged in that, and Doug, the director of Miyamoto, mentioned the letter that was written outlining the stance of state lands, Department of Ag, and Wyoming Game and Fish, and we have made it very, very clear that we do not support really even the discussion of reintroduction of bears there until, one, the social issues are resolved. But in addition to that, the prairie dogs on the Thunder Basin National Grassland, black-tailed prairie dogs, they're very, very susceptible to plague. And as Joe mentioned, right now we're looking at another outbreak of plague, and that is not suitable for long-term ferret relocation. And so through the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the Friends of the Black-Footed Ferret, they have been working very closely with Congress to come up with a 3-tiered program, and that program would include compensation for landowners, it would include funding for boundary control. In other words, if a landowner wanted to participate in that program, that there will be money available to ensure that prairie dogs that are on one piece of private land do not go on to adjoining properties. And then, I'm not sure what the compensation rate at this time is. And then the third is flight vaccine for those. So I believe they're actually going to approach our delegation in Washington in early March. And I know that Terry Frankhauser with Colorado Stocklands Association has been very, very engaged in that process, and I think that Jim has also been engaged in that to some degree. So if they're successful in securing that funding, and with what Doug's talking about as far as, them taking a look at what's going on the grasslands, we might actually be able to make some proposal on this at some point.
Good. Thank you. Any other questions for Joe? Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it.
Members of the Commission, Board of Ag, Justin Williams with the Department of Ag and the Policy Division as well. I'm the counterpart with Joe. I cover the southern half of the state as well as then kind of the western part, both on forest and on BLM. We were asked to cover the topic of domestic sheep and bighorn sheep interaction. As many of you know, the state of Wyoming has worked really cooperatively well between the two departments as well as other organizations in regards to supporting the statewide working group plan that was approved in 2004. And with that plan, there was essentially 3 categories that we work with here in Wyoming. The core native herd that you'd obviously see up on the Shoshone, the Bridger Teton, and then the cooperative review areas where there's a mix between maybe some areas that have domestic sheep and then cooperatively working with the bighorn sheep. Some of those herds may be augmented and with transplants, and then there's the non-emphasis herd. Our plan has been successful in a recent court decision that came out in July of 2017 on the Medicine Bow Route National Forest in support of having 2 management areas, specifically for the emphasis of domestic sheep herds in areas where there may be some bighorns, but again, it's addressing viability, which is part of the 1982 as well as the 2012 forest plan rule. So for today, what I wanted to do is just touch base a little bit on a couple of recent projects that we're working on. As a cooperating agency, the department has the ability to work with the National Forest to develop a range of alternatives for, in this case, domestic sheep grazing permits. And in the state of Utah, we do have cooperating agency status, which is a little bit unique. The High Uinta, Wasatch Cache, they have domestic sheep grazing allotments, as well as they're tying in with the Ashley National Forest. One of our board members, Sean Sims, is a permittee on that, and I'll let him speak too in regards to any details that I may have missed. But what I wanted to do is just let you know that the direction that we're working on in this particular project is very much in the development stage, but the allotments themselves, again, have Wyoming producers, but it does occur in Utah, and so both the Game and Fish staff with Wyoming as well as Department of Ag, myself, are serving on that to help to review and guide that document. And a little bit of background on the High Uinta allotments was there was a decision in 1988 where they were looking at a decision notice in a FONSI, which finding of no significant impact from an environmental assessment on burnt beaver analysis area. This decision included the ability for the state of Utah to reintroduce bighorn sheep. It is in a wilderness area, and there is a clause in there that talks about an objective for wilderness to not restock domestic sheep grazing allotments, specifically in wilderness, if those allotments were vacant. So in 1989, after that decision was issued, the state of Utah did introduce bighorn sheep to the Hole in the Rock area. Fast forward a little bit, on the 30th of December 2007, the decision memo for permit renewals for Gilbert Peak, Hassey Lake, Henry's Fork, as well as Red Castle, East Fork, Blacks Fork, Middle Fork, Blacks Fork, Lyman Lake, Little West Fork, Blacks Fork, and Elizabeth Mountain number 2. Those were the ones that I was able to quickly go through and find. In that case, 2007, they issued decisions to renew those permits under a categorical exclusion. In December of 2010, there was a lawsuit against the U.S. Forest Service, and it wasn't just on these allotments, but also across other states where a grazing rider was used to continue livestock grazing, and obviously in this case was for domestic sheep. That decision then was settled in October of 2013, and then that settlement agreement itself is that they had agreed to, the Forest Service would rescope and issue new decisions on those allotments and not to continue to reissue those under the grazing rider following the decision. What comes into play in those particular cases is that now, as the years have passed, originally that there was a proposal and the follow through the implementation of bighorn reintroductions and supportive of being able to manage something that we would have as an equivalent of a cooperative review area, maybe ensuring there was some level of separation between those two species, and then now where we're looking at reissuing those permits under an environmental assessment, or most likely an environmental impact statement in EIS, which is a more extensive document, is that the Forest Service agreed to rescope that by May of 2014. Specifically, the Department of Ag did comment and issued comments specific to the scoping and the notice of intent. We commented on the first one in May of 2014. Second, they reissued one, another notice of intent in December of 2015. And finally, another scoping they took from an EA to an EIS, and they reissued another scoping in February of 2016. So where we're at is we are in the middle of developing a range of alternatives cooperatively. We work together to help to develop the alternatives, but also to support both industry for bighorn as domestic sheep. So the concern comes from recent decisions. Again, I mentioned the one on the Medicine Bow. There was another decision in the District of Idaho where that was November of 2017. And in that case, just a very, very quick overview. Stacia Berry from our department also has more information at the end if we had time. But again, it was just in the case of that there was a concern in that one where there was reintroduced herd to Idaho, and then the ability for the Forest Service to be able to continue livestock grazing with domestic sheep in areas where, for us, is a cooperative review area. And so there is concern for the producers, and I'll let Sean speak if you would like to give more detail, but to address how that decision is going to affect Wyoming, not only Wyoming producers, but domestic sheep producers across the West, and how we would continue and to be able to manage. And there is definitely a lot of eyes on our state. Our plan has supported both industries and to make good, solid decisions. And I think there's just an ongoing concern about how we move forward, and then what that those decisions on other forests are going to do, and how that they may impact Wyoming. In addition to the Uinta Wasatch Cache, we're also working on the Kemerer Ranger District. There is a decision that will come out in the next couple of years. Also, I'm guessing it will go to an EIS level. It is near the Darby bighorn sheep herd. That is one area where we've agreed that it was a non-emphasis. There are a number of what we call the K-17. There are 17 allotments that they're going to pool those together and do a programmatic decision. And I think as we work through these decisions, that we're going to start having to make hard decisions about where we might put domestic sheep and to continue that industry at the same time as supporting bighorn sheep across our state. So I'll leave it at that. Sean, I'd like to offer that time to you as well. I'm sure I'm missing a lot, and I appreciate the time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Justin, thank you for the update on that. I'll give you more of an overview from my personal standpoint and my neighbors down in southwest Wyoming. Most of us have ranches on the Wyoming side of the line, but the north slope of the Uintas just go right up. I mean, it's on the foothills of the Uintas, so we graze our sheep up in there, and a lot of this is, I don't believe there's anybody that actually trucks in. There's designated trails and stuff that we've gone in there. In 88 or 89, they reintroduced the bighorn sheep in that area, and in doing so, we gave up 3 allotments that said we'd never stock again in the Burnt Fork Beaver Creek area. And in doing that, the intention of the Forest Service and the sheep producers was that that would be their area. And we have a letter to fact and that says no other adverse, I guess, if I wish I could quote the letter, but adverse effects on your sheep permits would take place by giving those 3 allotments. So now we're sitting here with Western Watersheds filing these appeals and doing the risk of contact. We are sitting with 5 allotments in that review that they settled on. There were 77 allotments. They settled on 11, and 5 of them happen to be in the Wasatch Cache Forest. The injunction that was just handed down basically said the Forest Service wasn't going fast enough with their the EIS process. Oh, by the way, these 2 allotments were part of those 11 that got settled on. So they that sets a precedence for these 5 allotments up there. The issue we have is they did this 2 days before they were supposed to turn out on this allotment. If they did that, we're trailing into the forest. There's no way to, it would be a disaster. So we're kind of preparing, because I believe that's where Western Watersheds will go again, is try and get an injunction. Now that court case will be heard. The other scary thing is that injunction, we're tied to that with them allotments that's in the settlement agreement. One of the issues that we have is that's in Utah. Utah has a Bighorn management plan, but nothing like the collaborative effort that the Bighorn Domestic Sheep Working Group has and the credence that has. So I think we're going to face an uphill battle on that. I'm not sure what else the board would like to hear other than it's going to be, we have a very strong sheep industry in southwest Wyoming, and it's going to devastate that, because it's 2 months of our year that we have no place else to go right now. So if there's any questions or...
Sean, is that service in Utah, is that in Region 4?
Yes, it is in Region 4. And you know, when you start talking the region, you start talking the courts, the Ninth Circuit is just that's Western Watershed's obvious court of choice. I don't know how the Utah sits in the 10th Circuit. I don't know whether that would bring any change or the precedent's already been set. That's a concern we have as far as, you know, any legal ramifications to that.
Any other questions? Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin.
Okay.
Turn it over to you. Oh, Doug, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, the agenda, I was going to discuss the Animal Damage Management Board Wolf Management Program funding, just briefly. I don't have a lot to report just because the budget session hasn't started yet, but I can tell you this. We had a wolf management program housed in the Department of Ag that started with the 2013-2014 biennium. And at that time, the state of Wyoming had management for wolves, as the Protection for Endangered Species Act had recently come off. And so we had a program, we promulgated rules for that program for the predator zone, and there was $250,000 of funding that would reimburse predator districts around the state that had to go out and remove problem wolves. So in the fall of 2014, when the protections were restored for wolves, Director Talbot and I met a number of times over the issue, trying to decide what the wisest course of action would be regarding our wolf management fund. And because we no longer had jurisdiction for wolves, our program didn't really fit for reimbursement of wolf removals anymore, because the federal government had all the jurisdiction to make decisions about when, what, where, and how those wolves were removed. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with Wildlife Services, APHIS, together provided wolf management activities under the Endangered Species Act until they were once again delisted last year. What we've done as a department in response is that part of our exception budget request for the upcoming biennium, we submitted a request to restore that program. The rules were already promulgated, so we have this program that's authorized, it just wasn't funded. So what we did is we went back in and we requested $500,000 to be put back into the Department of Ag's Wolf Management Program. That was based on collecting data from Fish and Wildlife Service and Wildlife Services regarding the degree to which they expended money for wolf management activities during the time that they had jurisdiction for wolves. So that's how we came up with our figure. We just went and asked our federal counterparts how much money they had spent for wolf management control activities in the time that they were managing wolves. They told us, we estimated that that level of work wouldn't decrease. So that's what we submitted in our exception budget request. $250,000 of that was approved by the governor, and it will now go in front of the legislature for their consideration. As a point of interest, $250,000 is also the degree, that's the level that the program was initially authorized when it was up and running before the protections were restored for wolves originally. So that's where it stands right now, is that we have an exception budget request that's up for consideration for this budget session that hopefully will restore the operability of our wolf management program for the predator zone. We had our Joint Appropriations Committee hearing a week ago Monday, and one of the questions that we fielded during that hearing was the question of, is any predator district available or eligible to request reimbursement for wolf work, or is it only those districts that participate in our current ADMB program? We have, I think, 19 county predator boards from around the state that currently participate in our ADMB program. And the answer to that is no. The rules were written so that any predator district could request reimbursement for wolf work in the predator zone. So that's how it's set up now. Hopefully that'll go through. That's the most information that I have on our restoration efforts for that program. But the good news is everything's already set for the program to go. The rules are written. A lot of the districts have participated in the program in the past, and we just need the funding to stand it back up, and off we'll go. So that's where we're at, unless anybody has any questions with wolf management.
Oh, thank you, Dick. Go ahead. Okay, with that, we will move on to some game and fish issues. Doug Brimmeyer is going to give us an update on sage grouse. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the commission, and members of the board. So my name's Doug Brimmeyer, Deputy Chief of Wildlife, and give you an overview of sage grouse management for the state of Wyoming. So Wyoming, of course, is under the core area strategy, which limits human disturbance to those in those most important habitats across the state. And the core area strategy has basically been referenced by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2015 when they made the non-warranted decision, and representing that the core area strategy, once implemented, would ensure conservation of the species. During the last year, the department transitioned from our funding through the general fund to the department, and we've been maintaining that program through our budget now. This past year, we had 1,800 leks, known leks across the state. Personnel and NGOs and other agency personnel and members of the public helped us survey 89% of those leks. 1,200 of those leks were active. Nearly 1,200 leks were active. 299 were inactive, and 140 leks were unknown or not checked. The number of birds that we observed was average 32 males per active lek. This is down from 2016 when 36 males per active lek were observed. The high was 42 males per lek in 2006, and the low was 13 males per lek in 1996. We also, across the state, a lot of our personnel are putting out wing barrels. If you're traveling to a hunting area, a lot of those access points will have a barrel at the end of one of the access roads, and so our personnel collected over 2,000 wings last year. An analysis of those wings indicate that we had 1.2 chicks per hen. That's right on target with the 10-year average. And generally, we'd like to see 1.4 to 1.6 chicks per hen for an increasing population, or to reach stability or an increasing population. So we're down a little bit on that, but it's still right on par with the 10-year average. And so with that number of chicks last year, we can expect a slight decline in the number of males per active lek this year. We're kind of anticipating. We've been working with North Dakota on a collaboration to monitor a reintroduction effort in North Dakota. It's part of a larger study that is looking at reintroductions in California and Nevada as well. And they're getting birds, I think, from Utah for California and Nevada. In North Dakota, the 60 birds that we moved there, we saw some pretty large movements. We had, out of the 40 hens that were moved there, we had 8 nests that were initiated in North Dakota. 3 of those 8 were successful at nesting, and only one of the hens actually had a successful brood. But the birds, once they were released, we saw some really large movements from the release site. And so our agency with North Dakota is working on some potential mitigation measures to try and ease that release this year. And so we're looking at some options to capture some birds at a different time, take some hens possibly that already have a brood, and release them rather than taking 40 hens and then just dropping them on their sites up there. Also, during the past year, the bird farm legislation, you may remember or recall, was passed, and that allows a certified bird farm to apply for the collection of eggs. And so far we've got 1 application, and we certified that bird farm to collect eggs, and so we'll be evaluating some of the methodology and locations for egg collections in the future. And with that, I would open it up for any questions you may have.
Questions for Doug? So Doug, I've got one. The number of males per lek went from 36 last year to 32 this year.
That's correct.
Now they have a fairly predictable cycle, cyclical nature. Is this the point in the point in time when you would expect that downturn in population, or is this an anomaly? Or
I think we're expecting a little bit of a downturn, especially with when we corroborate that with the number of chicks that we look at from the wing data that's collected, which indicates we're going to be down a little bit, and so we'll see a slight decline probably this year.
Fairly normal then, nothing
I
to
would
be
believe
too
so.
concerned about. Okay. Other questions for Doug? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Now we'll call Brian Nesvik up. Brian is going to give us an update on the status of grizzly bears and wolves.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, members of the commission. As President Culver indicated, I'm Brian Nesvik. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Chief Game Warden and the Chief of the Wildlife Division. And I've got just a little bit of information for you on both, and then I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have. Compared to meetings past, we have some very good news to share. It's old news now, relatively speaking, but both species, grizzly bears and wolves, are back under the management of the state, which is certainly a good thing from most of our perspective in the room. So delisting for grizzly bears occurred in August. We it was a little bit of a surprise to us, to tell you the truth. We'd worked on it for a number of years, and it had kind of stalled out. And when the new administration turned over, we didn't receive a lot of information. And to our surprise, we learned in June that they would be delisted fairly quickly. And so we began, once they were delisted in August, by conducting some internal meetings and talking about our Commission's grizzly bear management plan that was revised and approved by the Commission in May of 2016. And we decided that one of the best things we could do is to take and go back out to the public without any real proposals or without any preconceived notions, and just ask the public for some feedback on the 5 major components of our grizzly bear management plan. And those 5 major components are research, monitoring, conflict management, information and education, and hunting. And so we did exactly that. We went and we held a variety of meetings around the state. We also conducted some targeted interactions with different stakeholders, including members of the agricultural industry, sportsman groups, environmental groups, conservation organizations, and we conducted those across the state as well. We also did something that the department has done, experimented with here over the last couple of years, and we did a Facebook Live session, which essentially allows anybody in the world to get on the internet and watch the same presentation that we gave around the state, and then be able to provide some feedback on their perspectives on the grizzly bear management plan. So we did all of that primarily through the September, October, November months, a little bit into December, and now we're going to give, tomorrow we'll be giving the Game and Fish Commission a very detailed summary of what we learned from all those meetings, and also be talking about what the future may be with regards to regulations and how we're going to implement these things we heard from the public. I did want to talk a little bit about kind of what the current distribution is, and this is always an interesting thing to look at. The current population status is actually, using the population estimator that we use now, looking strictly inside of what's called the demographic monitoring area, which is the area where we monitor grizzly bears, where we actively collect population information. The population over time has now stabilized. I mean, it's still a slight increase year to year, but over time it went from a fairly steep incline, 4 to 7% over a lot of years, while the grizzly bear populations were recovering, to a point now where it's fairly stable to slightly increasing. The most recent population estimate is 718 bears, and that kind of goes up or down from year to year, not in a significant way though for the last several years. Like I said, that population has flattened. I think last year the population estimate was just below 700, so there was a slight increase this year. Now that population estimate only includes bears inside of this blue line. And as you'll see here in just a minute, we now have a pretty significant expansion of grizzly bear populations outside of this blue line. This next series of, or this kind of animation will show you from 1990 to 2016 how the population changed. Just to orient you to this map a little bit, again, this line is the demographic monitoring area, the DMA, the area within which that recovery is measured. This line right here is the original primary conservation area that was established when the recovery plan was developed for grizzly bears. And the red area that you're going to see is basically the female grizzly bear occupied range within that within the area of northwest Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And then the green area, the green shaded area, is where there's occupancy of grizzly bears, but we haven't documented females denning and reproducing in those areas. So watch this as it progresses over time, and you can really see how the grizzly bear population has expanded. Right about here is when grizzly bear populations were considered fully recovered. And you can see in this animation, 2016, that essentially all of the habitats within the demographic monitoring area are occupied by grizzly bears. Not all reproducing females, but they're all those areas are occupied, and then there are several areas, Wyoming Range, Southern Wind River Range, and along this eastern front of the Absarokas in Wyoming, where grizzly bears have expanded outside of the demographic monitoring area. And in fact, the town of Cody is now within actual occupied grizzly bear habitat for both females and males. The town of Jackson, you can see, is very, very close to that. So anyway, it's a conservation success story, but it also represents some challenges for management and a need for the commission to move forward with executing their grizzly bear management plan. This last year, as has been the case for the last several years, with an expanding population, with continued growth, we've continued to have increasing livestock conflicts. There have been, you know, the levels from year to year peak and wane. Some years are better than others, but the trend line over time for the grizzly bear population is upward, and the trend line over time for grizzly bear conflicts with livestock and also with humans is also up. They kind of correspond to one another. The good news story with that is if you go back and you look through, go back clear into the 1990s, and you look at conflicts as a proportion to the number of bears that were actually in occupied habitats in Wyoming, we've done a better job over time. People have learned and changed some of their practices to a point where the conflicts as a proportion to the, you know, compared to the grizzly bear population have declined. However, you know, the total number of conflicts has definitely gone up with the grizzly bear population. One of the things that is also correspondingly gone up is the cost for the Game and Fish Commission as they compensate landowners for grizzly bear damage, and then what we'll talk about next with wolf damage. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is this past year, some of you may have heard, I know the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission is quite familiar with this, but we had pretty significant increase in human conflicts for whatever reason this past year, and there's probably a variety of factors that played into that. But when we have increased human conflicts, we have increased mortality of bears, and so this past year, the number of grizzly bears that were killed in the ecosystem either as a result of control actions because they were in trouble in conflict with livestock, or as a result of coming in conflict with humans in self-defense type actions where a person was attacked and they defended themselves and killed the bear. All of those incidents were up in 2017, and all in livestock related, in site conflicts or human injury, and then also in hunting related conflicts. All three of those categories, grizzly bear mortality was up. With that, I thought I'd talk a little bit about where we're at with litigation. There are several suits currently filed. We continue to have management authority. There's not been an injunction filed as of yet, but we're obviously, you know, looking for that and wondering if and when it may occur. The other thing that has happened that's interesting is when the court decision occurred with the Great Lakes wolf, there was a recent wolf decision. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar. But essentially one of the things that came out of that is some descriptions about how the court felt about the establishment of distinct population segments or DPSs when a population of threatened or endangered species is delisted. And as a consequence of that, the service looked at that decision and said, well, we think there's some implications to the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear delisting, and they went out and asked the public to comment on their opinion or to provide their comments on the relationship between the decision in the Great Lakes wolf case and the delisting rule that was filed to delist the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. That public comment period began here recently. I'm going to say it was in December, and we're waiting now to find out exactly how the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to use that information, what their next steps may be. We don't know. They didn't come ask us what we thought. They notified us they were going to do this and did it. So with that, I'll stop on bears, and before we move on to wolves, I'll answer any questions that I can or or find the answers for you on grizzly bears.
No questions on grizzlies?
And ask Scott if I missed anything.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, so we'll talk next about wolves. And I'm going to go ahead and show you a picture of kind of the current distribution of wolves as well. So with wolves, again, favorable court ruling this past spring from the appellate court that placed management of gray wolves in Wyoming back in Wyoming's hands. This basically, the court decision that stopped and relisted wolves, the way that the commission handled that and the way the department handled that was they looked at it as the play button was, the pause button was pushed, and when the play button was pushed again, we basically resumed right where we left off. And so we took back over management of conflicts. That was kind of the first order of business because of the timing, because it was a May time frame. We don't typically have hunting seasons that early for wolves. And so we got back into the conflict business again, and then started planning for a hunting season. We did conduct a hunting season this past year. We had a quota of 44, and we harvested 44 within the trophy game management area. Outside of the trophy game management area, in the area where they're designated as predators, there were 32 that were harvested by hunters, and then another 15 that were taken in control actions, basically depredating livestock or taken by government agencies either before they were delisted or after they were delisted. So anyway, total mortality was about 162 wolves when you consider all known sources that we had this past year. The hunting season, by all measures, went well. We had positive feedback from hunters. We had, I think, 2 areas where the quota was exceeded, but we had other areas where it was below the quota, and so overall we came out right where we wanted to be with the harvest. The other thing that happened with delisting is we were able to put our people back on the job of monitoring wolves and doing the population biology work of establishing pack distribution as well as the population demographics. And so I think I feel comfortable that we have a better population estimate at the end of 2017 than we did when we took over management again from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we're in a good spot there. We've got to put some more collars out on wolves this winter. That work is going on now. But that's the main method that we use to try to establish the number of packs, where they're at, and how many wolves we have in the population. Again, as with grizzly bears, wolf depredations on livestock were up, and our conflict work with regards to those with wolf conflicts was up. Producers, we're back in the business of applying for and receiving lethal take permits that are not possible when wolves were listed. And unlike grizzly bears, livestock producers have the ability inside of the wolf trophy game management area to take wolves that are in the act of depredating on livestock. So all those actions resumed again. You can see here that pack distribution is probably not anything that is surprising. The couple of things that are interesting that have occurred since the last time they were delisted is there's a couple more established packs outside of the wolf trophy game management area than there were before. You look down here in the Southern Winds, this Lander pack, as well as this pack here. This pack was here before, but these packs were not necessarily established and didn't exist in their current state before when wolves were delisted. We continue to be under a requirement for post-delisting monitoring by the Fish and Wildlife Service. That's a 5-year requirement. We're assuming that that began again as soon as they were delisted this time, and there's not any indication that that the last period that they were delisted would count towards that 5 years. We still have a requirement as a state to maintain at least 10 breeding pairs and 100 individual wolves, and a commitment for a non-numerical buffer above that inside of the wolf trophy game management area. I'm not aware of any current litigation, and I haven't heard of any. So I expect and I'm hopeful that we can continue to manage wolves into the future. That's what I've got on wolves. What questions do you have on wolves?
Go ahead, Sean.
Mr. Chairman, Brian, you mentioned collaring the wolves and keeping track of them. As these wolves get in the predator zone, is there a mechanism to get any of that collared data to, as they get in trouble or we have conflicts, is there a mechanism to get that data, or can it be accessed by APHIS to be able to control those wolves outside of the
Yeah, and I can't speak specifically to how we've done that in the past or if we have, but the answer to your question is yes. There is a way to be able to share that information so that we can help with depredations.
Because if we got $250,000 and we start chasing wolves, that's going to burn that up very fast. And the most efficient way, you know, if we have to take a wolf, would be the least, you know, if we could at least zero in on where they're at so we can take that appropriate wolf. Absolutely, and our experience has been similar. You know, when we've had to do control actions inside the wolf trophy game management area, that's the most effective way, is you find the collared wolves in the pack and you're able to more quickly find them. So the short answer to your question is yes. Thank you. Yeah.
So Brian, you said about 76 wolves were harvested by hunters. 15 were removed by the agency in control action, but 162 was the total mortality?
Yeah, actually, I only mentioned the control actions outside of the WTGMA. There were also 46 wolves taken in control actions within the trophy game management area.
Okay.
For a total mortality of 162, I think, if my math is right.
Thank you. Other questions for Brian? Yeah, Mike.
And I guess I'll ask it politically correct, what is the official policy on wolves and bighorns?
So, you know, any wolves, as far as the Game and Fish Commission is concerned, that are in the predatory, in the area where they're defined as predatory animals, the commission doesn't take an active role in managing, and so, you know, the commission has no interest in managing for wolf populations in the Bighorn Mountains, if that is what you're trying to get at.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Brian. Are there any other topics that any member here would like to introduce? If not, I guess we should offer a call to the public specific to this joint meeting of the Board of Ag and the Game and Fish Commission. And what I'd like to do is offer that call to the public, and then after that, we will take a 5-minute recess and reseat the commission, and then issue a call to the public concerning Game and Fish Commission issues. So, is there any member of the public that would like to address this joint meeting? Okay, we do have a couple back there. Go ahead and approach the podium if you would like. I'm sorry, sir, you'll have to introduce yourself. I don't.
My name is Peter Ehrenbell. I'm the president of the Sublette County Predator Animal Board. Okay. And I wanted to speak to the funding of the wolves control, and I'm very much in favor of it. Sublette County has had a very efficient, low-budget predator program because we were having the wolf control done by the feds. Now the game has changed. We recently pursued a pack of wolves that had hit some sheep in the predator area, and it took over a quarter of our budget to get one wolf killed. These wolves over time are costing over $10,000 a head to get taken out. So it's a very serious situation. One question I had for the commission is that if the Game and Fish is pursuing wolves in the trophy area and they cross over into the predator area, will they continue to pursue those wolves and remove them? Or are we going to have a DMZ type situation where we stop the hunt at the line?
I guess we would ask Mr. Nesvik to address that question.
So I think the short and easy answer to that is when we determine that control action is necessary in order to deal with a damage situation that occurs inside the trophy game management area where the commission's responsible for paying the damage, you know, our goal is to conduct that control action. And so the answer to your question is no, we wouldn't stop at the DMZ. We'd continue to do what we need to do to basically take care of the commission's interest.
Okay, one other question. Will you collar wolves in the predator area or just in the trophy areas?
Yeah, our interest is certainly in collaring wolves inside of the TGMA. We don't have management authority for predatory animals outside, and so I don't see that we would collar wolves outside of the trophy game management area.
Thank you, Brian.
Are any of the funding going to go towards collaring wolves in the predator area if we get this Department of Ag funding?
We haven't been approached about, there's a couple different pots of money available to districts. We have one for hard and fast predatory animal control efforts, and then we have another research pot of funding. We haven't reviewed a proposal yet, and I wouldn't want to speak for the Animal Damage Management Board, but it's certainly something that I think would be entertained.
Right. As Sean said, that's the most efficient route for us in the predator. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ehrenbell.
One question.
Yes.
Pete, stick around. So if it goes before the Animal Damage Board, you gotta wait till their next meeting in June, or when would that, if you're gonna call her, how long has he gotta wait for this to happen?
Yeah, you know, traditionally, that would be the way that it would happen. We don't have any provisions for emergency collaring activities, but I don't know if there's anything that we contemplated. This is a new angle to look at this for me. I haven't digested all of that fully yet. Is Kent Drake? I don't mean to put Kent on the spot here, but my question is just this: have you had any calls, Kent, from any of the districts about a potential collaring effort to this point in time?
Mr. Director, members of the board, commissioners. No, I have worked with Mike Foster with Wildlife Services, and we've talked a little bit about that, and they've got some experimental collaring techniques they'd also like to explore, but we have not done anything and had no requests at this time.
It is something we'll take under advisement, though.
What happens then? Okay, it's this spring when they start lambing, and you got these wolves out in the predator area. Then what happens?
The way that the program works is that predator district can go out and pursue those wolves and remove them, and then they just submit a reimbursement request to the department, and we'll reimburse them for their expenses. But there's no process that they have to go through up front for that activity.
Mr. President?
Yes, go ahead.
Why would you want to collar them if you've got them trapped in the predator zone?
Well, they're like smoke. I mean, you know, if we have a wolf and if we don't kill, say we take out the pack and we leave that collared wolf, more wolves come in, he brings them to us. So we'll know where they are.
That would be in theory, I mean.
Well, no, it works. That's worked before. And so, you know, from my experience, you can't go out and get a wolf in the Bighorn Mountains, put a collar on him, and throw him out in Sublette County, because those wolf packs will knock him out. They'll kill him on the spot.
Taking out the whole pack, you've eliminated the problem, haven't you?
Well, you can see on that map, they just keep coming. They just keep coming. So it's.
If you've got a wolf trap and you want to put a collar on them, unless you know there's more wolves out there, I guess.
Right. And that's the theory, is if you have them trapped and you don't have the whole pack, then you put that collar on him, you release him, he goes back up, finds his pack, you get the telemetry, you fall out, then you can take the pack. You know, it's that kind of a theory. You'd have to trap them first, right?
Okay, yeah, Sean.
Mr. Chairman, Doug, I got a question for clarification, though. With that money being in your exception budget, nothing can be expended till the new biennium, right?
That's correct. All activities are contingent upon funding availability.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you. Thank you. Kent, you've already said what you wanted to say. Okay, any other member of the public that would like to address this group? Yes, go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Josh Corsi. I'm with the Muley Fanatic Foundation. This is direct primarily to the Department of Ag. I was curious if, in regards to feral horses, if there's more room for the NGO community to be involved in working on some of the solutions to that, or be able to provide support to some of the lack of frustrations that obviously aren't gaining any ground.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that there is. In the recent past, we have been at different meetings and summits where we're trying to essentially put together a coalition of support, because most of the action that is needed for effective management of feral horses needs to happen at the congressional level. And so there certainly is room for NGO support in that realm, you know, on the political front. In terms of the day-to-day management, right now what the department has going is essentially research. We had one-time funding to conduct some research. I think we've got a pretty good handle on the projects that we have going forward right now, and we don't have any new requests for proposal on additional studies at this time. But that's not to say there won't be some in the future. If there are, we would certainly reach out. As much support as we can get for effective management of feral horses, we would look for support anywhere we could get it.
I guess I would just like to offer up that in support of whatever messaging you have, if there's another avenue for that message to be furthered through some of those other areas, I think the will is there.
Thank you, sir. I'll get some contact information from you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Sean.
Just in response to that, Josh, there is a wild horse and burro rangeland management coalition that there are quite a few members to that might be of interest to you. That's been operated out of DC, but I mean, some of the members, Farm Bureau, Sheep Industry, Congressional Sportsman's Foundation, the Mule Deer Foundation. So I don't know whether that funnels that to them, but there's a list of them on there that there's been some success with their coalition there.
Great. If there's a way that we can engage more at a grassroots local level and help encourage some of those others that are fighting that battle, we'd be happy to.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I guess we've concluded our business here today, and thank everybody for coming. It's always enjoyable to meet together with you folks. We've got so many common items to visit about. With that, I guess we will go ahead and adjourn, and then in 5 minutes, the Game and Fish Commission will reconvene for our call to the public. Thank you.